Do you remember the clever cooking tricks only 50s housewives knew and we forgot? These tricks stretched groceries and kept families fed with everyday ingenuity. What wisdom did we lose when those kitchens faded from memory? Quick cornflake candy clusters showcased the creative use of breakfast cereal in 1950s sweets, offering a treat that could be made in one pan and cooled in minutes. Housewives melted corn syrup and peanut butter together until smooth, then gently folded in crunchy cornflakes to coat each flake with the warm mixture. Spoonfuls were dropped onto waxed paper, where they set into crisp, chewy clusters that children could grab as soon as they cooled. This no-bake dessert became a favorite for school events, church socials, and rainy day kitchen projects with children. The peanut butter provided protein and a rich flavor, while the corn syrup bound everything together without the need for an oven. Because it required no precise measuring or fancy equipment, it was nearly foolproof, a quality every busy homemaker appreciated. The sweet aroma filled the kitchen quickly, making it almost impossible to wait for the clusters to harden completely before tasting. In less than 10 minutes, a box of cereal transformed into a memorable candy that defined simple home indulgence. Condensed soup as a sauce base was the shortcut that felt anything but lazy. Cream of mushroom, tomato, chicken, it all came in cans stacked high in the pantry. Housewives relied on them to turn plain casseroles into creamy, hearty meals with just one stir. Instead of making bechamel from scratch, you opened a can and added milk or broth. Suddenly, you had a thick, smooth sauce that tasted homemade. It was fast, affordable, and tasted good with nearly everything: pasta, rice, meat, or vegetables. One can could coat an entire dish. And when you were feeding 5 people on a 2-meal budget, that mattered. It helped bring consistency to meals and gave new life to leftovers. You could even mix 2 flavors to make your own twist. It was a blank canvas that worked with whatever was in the fridge. That kind of flexibility was gold in a 1950s kitchen. These soups may have started as shelf-stable convenience food, but they became a trusted tool in every cook's kit. Housewives did not just use them, they elevated them. And that was the trick all along. Boiled apple core pectin for jams was a brilliant example of how nothing went to waste, not even the parts most of us toss. When you peeled apples for pies, sauces, or snacks, you saved the cores and skins in a pot. Add water, bring it to a boil, and simmer it down until it became thick and sticky. That cloudy, pale liquid was pure pectin, the natural thickener that made your jams and jellies set without extra sugar or gelatin. You strained it through a cloth and saved it in jars, ready to add to the next batch of strawberry preserves or grape jelly. This trick gave structure to homemade spreads and let families stretch their fruit harvest further. It also meant that one bag of apples could serve 3 or 4 purposes, not just one. Store-bought pectin became popular later, but for many years, this was the only kind you had. The trick worked best with tart apples, especially those a little underripe. It is barely mentioned now, but it was once as essential as sugar itself in rural kitchens. Tomato aspic salad squares brought a savory twist to the mid-century love affair with gelatin, turning a simple tomato base into a striking dish for buffet tables. Housewives dissolved unflavored gelatin in seasoned tomato juice, adding a splash of lemon juice and a pinch of celery salt for brightness. Once set in a shallow pan, the firm red sheet was cut into tidy cubes or squares and arranged on lettuce leaves for serving. The cool, slightly tart bites provided a refreshing contrast to rich meats and creamy side dishes often found at potlucks or holiday spreads. Because the aspic could be made well in advance and required no last-minute attention, it became a dependable choice for hostesses who wanted both beauty and practicality. Guests admired the jewel-like appearance and the unexpected savory flavor that lingered lightly on the tongue. This recipe reflected the era's fascination with molded salads and the desire to transform everyday ingredients into something elegant with little effort or expense. Reheating cold biscuits with a damp towel was one of those little touches that made leftovers feel fresh again. When dinner rolls or breakfast biscuits turned dry overnight, you did not toss them. You brought them back to life. Housewives would dampen a clean kitchen towel, wrap the biscuits inside, and heat them in a warm oven for a few minutes. The steam worked its magic. Biscuits softened up, regained their warmth, and felt nearly fresh-baked. This trick made second-day meals feel like first-class dining. It took 5 minutes, no extra cost, and 0 complaints at the table. In homes where everything counted, even baked goods got a second chance. The towel trick was simple, quiet, and incredibly satisfying. It meant care. It meant a kitchen that did not quit. And most importantly, it meant feeding your family without apology. These little floury rounds of comfort came back fluffy, warm, and ready to be slathered in butter. All because someone took the time to do it right. No shortcuts, just smart ones. Dough fluffing with vinegar and baking soda was one of those chemistry tricks that made you feel like a magician in the kitchen. No eggs? No problem. A splash of vinegar in your batter, mixed with baking soda, gave just enough lift to make pancakes, muffins, or quick breads rise like they had all the right ingredients. It fizzed as soon as you stirred it in, and you had to work fast. Those bubbles did not last forever. But if you timed it right, you got a tender crumb and a soft center without needing eggs or even milk. It was a lifesaver when rationing hit or when payday was still a few days away. Vinegar was cheap, baking soda was shelf-stable, and together they turned nothing into something. Modern recipes tend to leave this out, pushing people toward eggs or dairy substitutes. But vinegar and soda were the real original hack. They worked quietly, without a fuss, and gave families hot breakfasts and passable cakes even in the leanest times. Zwieback toast was the kind of food that got made, stored, and reused until there was nothing left but crumbs. Originally a German recipe, Zwieback is twice-baked bread, meaning it is baked once, sliced, and then dried out in the oven until crisp. During the 1930s, it became a go-to staple for households trying to stretch bread that was starting to go stale. The result was crunchy, dry, and perfect for storing without refrigeration. It could be softened with warm milk and sugar for children or crumbled into puddings and meatloaf fillers to bulk out recipes. Some families even soaked it in broth or fruit juice for dessert-like treats. When biscuits were gone and crackers were out of reach, Zwieback toast filled the gap. It had a mild flavor and could go sweet or savory, depending on what you added. People loved it for its reliability. It would not mold, spoil, or turn on you. You could keep it in a tin for weeks and still count on it to do its job. For babies and the elderly, it was soaked soft. For everyone else, it was just one more way to stretch bread far past its shelf life. Onion soup mix as meat marinade was one of the first true pantry hacks, and it came straight from a packet. Long before marinades came in bottled form, cooks reached for those little paper envelopes of instant onion soup mix and stirred them into everything. With just water and maybe a splash of oil, the mix became a tangy, deeply savory coating for chicken thighs, pot roast, or even pork chops. The salt, the dehydrated onion, the herbs, it was like magic in a bag. Suddenly, your dinner tasted slow-cooked without needing a spice rack. It became a staple in slow cookers, Sunday roasts, and midweek dinners that needed to feed 6 with not much to work with. The mix was cheap, available everywhere, and lasted practically forever in a drawer. Cookbooks and food ads praised it as flavor in minutes, and they were not wrong. Even now, some of the best meatloaf recipes still sneak in a packet. It was the kind of trick that made you look like a kitchen genius, even when all you did was open a box. Homemade rennet for cheesemaking was not for the faint of heart, but it got the job done. Before tablets and store-bought cultures, people used what they had, often vinegar, lemon juice, or for the brave ones, a bit of calf stomach lining. The process was part science, part tradition. You warmed milk gently, stirred in the curdling agent, and waited for the magic to happen. Once it separated into curds and whey, you strained it through cloth and pressed it into soft rounds or blocks. Some added salt or herbs, others kept it plain. The taste was fresh, a little tangy, and deeply rewarding. It was not just about saving money, it was about knowing how to make food from the ground up. Today's cookbooks mostly skip this, expecting readers to start with pre-made cheese or kits. But the old method taught patience and respect for the process. Cheese was no longer something you bought. It was something you made. Ketchup sandwiches were not a joke back then. They were survival. 2 slices of white bread, a squeeze of ketchup, and that was lunch. When fresh tomatoes were too expensive or gone altogether, the bottle stood in. It was cheap, it was sweet, and it gave just enough tang to fool your brain into thinking you had a real sandwich. Sometimes people would add onions or pickles if they had them, but most of the time it was just the red stuff and bread. And you would be surprised how many kids looked forward to it. It was bright, flavorful, and in a decade where most meals were beige, that mattered more than you would think. Ketchup was a staple condiment because it had a long shelf life and could cover the taste of anything going off. In this case, it became the main event. Parents handed it out with a smile, even if their hearts sank doing it. It was food, and that counted. You might laugh at it today, but in the 1930s, ketchup sandwiches were a reminder that even when the pantry was bare, you could still pretend to eat like everyone else. Leftover mashed potatoes turned into pancakes was a breakfast staple for families who refused to waste a single spoonful. The process was simple. You took cold, firm mashed potatoes, added a bit of flour or egg, and dropped the mixture into a hot skillet. Crisp on the outside, soft on the inside. It was comforting, filling, and downright thrifty. Housewives in the 1950s knew better than to toss leftovers. Potatoes were cheap, yes, but not so cheap you could afford to throw them out. These pancakes stretched a single dish across meals and added warmth to the morning. You could dress them up with chopped onions, garlic, or even leftover bits of cheese. Fried in bacon grease or butter, they gave off the kind of smell that made a kitchen feel alive. Kids loved them, husbands praised them, and moms appreciated the ease. Leftover night did not always mean boring. It meant clever. It meant knowing how to make something new out of what had already served its purpose. These potato pancakes did not just fill bellies, they proved that a little imagination could go a long, long way. Canned salmon patties turned a simple pantry staple into a golden brown main course that could be on the table in minutes, making it a reliable choice for housewives balancing busy schedules and tight budgets. Drained canned salmon was mixed with breadcrumbs, beaten egg, and a hint of onion or parsley before being shaped into small patties. These were quickly fried in a shallow layer of oil until crisp on the outside and tender inside. The mild fish flavor paired beautifully with a squeeze of lemon or a dollop of homemade tartar sauce, offering a taste of the sea without the cost of fresh seafood. Families appreciated that the recipe provided protein-rich nourishment while keeping grocery bills manageable. Because the ingredients were shelf-stable, it was easy to prepare even when the refrigerator was nearly empty. Many children remembered the satisfying crunch and warm, savory interior long after the last bite was gone, making this a beloved standby of the mid-century kitchen and a perfect example of fast, practical cooking. Making salad dressing in a washed-out ketchup bottle might sound like a stretch, but to a 1950s housewife, it was second nature. Once the bottle was empty, she would rinse it with hot water, add oil, vinegar, mustard, salt, sugar, and whatever herbs she had on hand. Then she would shake it up. No blender, no mess, just good old-fashioned elbow grease. That ketchup bottle became a reliable dressing shaker, ready whenever needed. It poured easily, stored well in the fridge, and cost nothing extra. You did not need to buy fancy bottles or mixers. You already had what you needed. It was clever, resourceful, and oddly satisfying. This trick came from the same spirit that saved string in a jar or foil in a drawer. Waste nothing. Use everything. Even if the bottle was glass, it still did its job. Housewives loved having control over their ingredients, especially with young kids at the table. No artificial flavors, just what they made themselves. Today we chase clean eating and low-waste trends. But back then, those ideas just meant doing things the smart way. And sometimes that meant turning trash into treasure with nothing more than a good shake. Evaporated milk whipped cream was the sort of dessert trick passed between neighbors, not down through cookbooks. When cream was too expensive or just plain missing from the fridge, you reached for that dented can of evaporated milk in the back of the cupboard. You chilled it until it was ice cold, sometimes freezing it for 10 minutes, and then beat it with a whisk or mixer until it fluffed up. If you added a little sugar and a drop of vanilla, you almost could not tell the difference. It would not hold shape as long as the real thing, but it made a bowl of canned peaches or gelatin salad feel like a special treat. Children did not care if it came from a cow or a can. If it looked creamy, that was enough. You could even fold it into puddings or layer it in trifles. The trick was to keep everything cold and to know when to stop mixing. Today's cookbooks skip this entirely. They assume everyone has heavy cream or will just buy whipped topping. But the old way worked just fine, and it felt like magic every time it turned out right. Apple butter and cream cheese tea sandwiches brought a gentle sweetness to afternoon gatherings while requiring only moments to prepare. Thin slices of soft bread were spread with smooth cream cheese and a generous layer of spiced apple butter, then pressed together and cut into neat triangles. The creamy tang of the cheese balanced the warm spices and fruit of the apple butter, creating a flavor that felt both comforting and slightly indulgent. Hostesses appreciated that the sandwiches could be assembled in advance and held their shape well on a tiered tray, making them ideal for tea parties or small social visits. Children enjoyed the mild sweetness, while adults found them a pleasing complement to hot tea or coffee. Because both main ingredients kept well in the refrigerator, they were a reliable option when unexpected company arrived or a quick snack was needed. These delicate sandwiches reflected the 1950s love of easy elegance and demonstrated how a few well-chosen pantry staples could create something charming and memorable. Powdered milk to bulk up regular milk was not glamorous, but it sure was dependable. In big families with small budgets, milk disappeared fast, so Housewives made it stretch by mixing whole milk with reconstituted powdered milk. You took a scoop of the powder, stirred it with water, and poured it into the fresh stuff to double the supply. It was not just thrift, it was survival. This trick made sure every child got a glass at breakfast, every recipe had enough for batter, and every cup of coffee got its splash of creaminess. Did it taste different? A little. But after a while, no one noticed. It became part of the routine. When you have mouths to feed and only so much to go around, a full jug matters more than the taste of a second pour. Powdered milk also stored longer and did not require refrigeration until mixed. That made it perfect for backup in a pinch. Housewives kept boxes in the pantry like it was gold dust. And truth be told, it kinda was. It gave a little more breathing room to a grocery bill that was already tight. Ham and pineapple toasties brought the bright sweetness of canned pineapple together with the smoky salt of sliced ham, creating a quick dish that looked elegant enough for unexpected guests while needing only minutes under the broiler. Housewives of the 1950s prized anything that could be made in 10 minutes, yet still feel special when set on the table for friends arriving after church or for a late afternoon bridge club snack. The pineapple rings came straight from the pantry, while the thin ham slices were usually left over from a weekend roast, making the recipe economical as well as fast. A simple white bread base toasted golden provided crunch and stability, while a light brushing of prepared mustard added a tang that balanced the fruit. Broiling for a few minutes melted the flavors together and filled the kitchen with a sweet, savory aroma that hinted of tropical getaways many homemakers only dreamed about. Children loved the contrast of warm fruit and salty meat, and adults enjoyed the effortless elegance that turned a weekday into a small celebration. Storing celery in aluminum foil was one of those little-known tricks that separated a wasteful kitchen from a wise one. Plastic wrap was not yet a common household item, and Tupperware was still a novelty for many families. So when a bunch of celery started to go limp, housewives would wrap it tightly in aluminum foil and tuck it into the fridge. This simple act worked like a charm. The foil let just enough moisture escape while keeping the celery firm and fresh. No soggy stalks, no odd smells, no food thrown out. That foil wrap could stretch a single bunch for nearly 2 weeks. Kids still got their crunchy snack, and dinner still had that satisfying snap in a soup or casserole. It sounds small, but it meant less waste and more money saved over time. Housewives passed this trick down like family folklore. You saw your mother do it, so you did it too. It was quiet, unfussy, and brilliant. In a time when food was money and money was tight, even celery got the 5-star treatment. You may not see it on a box today, but aluminum foil was a kitchen MVP before it even had the title. Wax paper butter roll storage was a simple solution with a whole lot of heart behind it. You took softened butter, mixed in whatever you had, maybe garlic, maybe parsley, maybe just a pinch of salt, and rolled it into a log using wax paper. Then it went straight into the freezer. When dinner came around, you would slice off a coin or two and melt it over hot vegetables, baked potatoes, or a skillet of greens. It felt luxurious, even when the ingredients were humble. Some people called them compound butters, but back then, they were just a practical way to stretch flavor and save time. You always had something on hand to make dinner feel a little more finished. The wax paper kept it clean, neat, and easy to slice without wasting any. It also let families portion out butter when it was rationed or in short supply. Today, we lean on spice mixes or bottled dressings. But back then, a wax paper roll of homemade butter was a quiet form of planning ahead and a small bit of comfort that waited patiently in the freezer. Sweet potato pie without eggs was a testament to how much flavor could be pulled from so little. Eggs were expensive, milk was scarce, and sugar had to be stretched, but sweet potatoes were dependable. You could bake them, mash them, and mix them with a bit of flour, spices, and molasses to create a smooth filling that held together without help. The crust was optional, and in many homes it was skipped entirely to save flour and fat. The pie was poured into a greased tin and baked until it firmed at the edges and browned just slightly on top. It was soft, earthy, and just sweet enough to count as dessert. Sometimes people would add a dab of butter or a splash of vinegar to deepen the flavor. You did not need whipped cream or toppings. This was comfort on its own. It tasted like autumn, like Sunday dinner, like something you made from scratch and with care. Sweet potato pie was not about presentation. It was about getting a little joy out of the root vegetables you had on hand. And back then, that joy meant everything. Tomato juice as a soup-based starter was one of those ideas that seemed too simple to matter, until you tried it. When canned broth was hard to find or too expensive, people needed something flavorful, shelf-stable, and easy to stretch. Tomato juice fit the bill perfectly. It added color, acidity, and a rich, savory base that made even the most basic vegetable soup taste like it had simmered for hours. It was especially popular in the 1940s and 1950s, when canned juices were lining grocery shelves and meat was either rationed or just plain pricey. Recipes would call for a cup of tomato juice, some diced potatoes or cabbage, and maybe a scoop of rice or beans. Suddenly, dinner was done. You could serve it with crackers or cornbread, or even pour it over noodles if you had them. It was quick, clean, and cost next to nothing. Some families even poured leftover tomato juice from canned tomatoes right into the pot. Waste not, want not. These soups were humble, but they were hearty, and sometimes that is all you needed, especially when times were tight. Velveeta tomato melt became a weeknight favorite because it turned ordinary garden tomatoes into a warm, satisfying dish in less than 10 minutes. Thick slices of ripe tomato were arranged on toast or even sturdy crackers, sprinkled with a touch of salt and pepper, and topped with generous slices of Velveeta cheese. A few minutes under a hot broiler transformed the cheese into a bubbling blanket that clung to the juicy fruit beneath. Housewives loved how the mild, creamy cheese mellowed the acidity of the tomato while the toast stayed crisp enough to pick up by hand. It required almost no preparation, no chopping beyond slicing the tomato, and the ingredients were inexpensive and easy to keep on hand year-round. Many children returning from school found this snack waiting as an after-school surprise, while adults often served it alongside a simple soup for a quick supper. The aroma of broiled cheese drifting through the kitchen was enough to gather the family around the table before the timer even rang. Marshmallow orange salad offered a bright splash of color and a sweet tang that brightened potlucks and Sunday dinners alike. Housewives combined canned mandarin segments with mini marshmallows, sweetened coconut, and a generous fold of freshly whipped topping to bind everything together in a light, fluffy cloud. The citrus juice lightly softened the marshmallows while keeping the overall texture airy and refreshing. This salad needed only a quick toss in a large bowl and a brief chill, making it an easy contribution to church socials or family gatherings where time was short and presentation mattered. The cheerful orange and white mixture looked festive in a cut glass dish and tasted like sunshine even during cold months when fresh fruit was scarce. Children loved sneaking spoonfuls straight from the refrigerator, while adults appreciated a dessert that felt both indulgent and effortless. With every bite, the combination of creamy sweetness and bright citrus embodied the playful optimism of the 1950s and the era's belief that convenience could still bring a touch of magic to the table. Folding leftovers into gelatin salads may raise eyebrows today, but in the 1950s it was a practical and pretty way to make scraps feel special. Housewives would take bits of ham, chopped vegetables, or even shredded chicken and suspend them in flavored or plain gelatin. Poured into a mold and chilled, it transformed odds and ends into a centerpiece. These salads might look odd to modern eyes, but back then they were admired for their color, their structure, and their thrift. You could use lemon gelatin for vegetables or tomato aspic for savory meats. It stretched small portions and added elegance to a plate, especially for luncheons or church potlucks. Kids might poke at them, but guests often smiled and served themselves a slice. It was creative, yes, but more than that, it was economical. When refrigeration was unreliable and meat was expensive, gelatin preserved and presented all at once. Housewives made the most of what was left and made it look like something fresh. Today, it seems like a trend frozen in time. But at the time, it was just smart homemaking with a little showmanship on the side. Gelatin from leftover soup bones was not some fancy culinary flex. It was how you made food go further when every cent counted. After stews, roasts, or broths, the bones were simmered low and slow until the liquid turned rich and jiggly once cooled. That was your homemade gelatin. No boxed packets, no artificial flavors, just bones, water, and time. You could use it to set savory aspics, stretch stews into filling cold meals, or add body to gravies and sauces. Some families poured it into molds with vegetables or meat shreds, creating those odd but beloved gelatin loaves you still hear about. It was thrift, protein, and texture all in one bowl. When chilled, it held shape like store-bought gelatin, but with flavor and nutrition store versions could not touch. Modern recipes barely mention this anymore, maybe because the process takes patience. But for families who had little to spare, it was a quiet way to hold on to every bit of goodness the meal had to offer. Jelly omelets were the kind of oddball depression dish that worked better than expected. Eggs were easier to get than meat, especially if you had chickens, but they still had to stretch. So when there was no bacon or sausage, people got creative. They spread jam or jelly inside a folded omelet and served it like breakfast dessert. Grape, apple, strawberry, whatever you had, often homemade and preserved. It was sweet, soft, and oddly satisfying. The egg and sugar made something that felt like a treat, even if it was born of necessity. For children, it was special. For adults, it was just another way to avoid waste. You could swap in stewed fruit or mashed banana if jelly was gone. It was quick, flexible, and checked every box for a depression meal. It might seem strange today, but it made sense back then. When food was limited, taste mattered more than rules. Soda pop in cake batter sounds like a kid's prank, but for decades it was a real kitchen trick, and one that actually worked. When families were short on eggs, butter, or milk, they found that a can of cola or lemon lime soda added not just sweetness, but airiness to boxed cake mixes. The bubbles acted like a leavening agent, giving the batter a lift and a fluffiness that surprised even skeptical bakers. Lemon lime soda went into yellow cakes and cupcakes, while cola paired beautifully with chocolate. The result was a moist, tender crumb that needed no buttercream to be good. Sometimes people would even mix flavored gelatin powder into the batter to amp up the color and make it match the soda. Bright pink for strawberry soda, green for lime, orange for, well, orange. It was part dessert, part science experiment, and always a hit at potlucks and school parties. You would find versions of this in cookbooks with titles like Fun with Cake Mixes or Desserts for a Crowd. Even today, some bakers swear it is the fastest way to get a light, fluffy cake without worrying about what is in the fridge. And they are not wrong. Minute steak sandwiches gave busy 1950s homemakers a hearty meal that could be cooked and assembled in less than 10 minutes while still feeling like a treat worthy of a sit-down dinner. Thin slices of beef, known as minute steaks, were quickly seasoned with salt and pepper before being seared in a hot skillet until browned on each side. The speed of the cooking kept the meat tender and juicy while producing a rich aroma that filled the kitchen almost instantly. Buttered sandwich rolls were warmed at the edge of the pan so they absorbed the flavorful drippings, turning a simple cut of beef into something special. Many women used this recipe to satisfy hungry families on evenings when errands or social obligations cut into cooking time. Children loved the combination of soft bread and flavorful beef, and adults appreciated that the meal felt like a restaurant-style sandwich without the expense or travel. It became a weeknight classic that fit the post-war American love for quick yet substantial dinners that showcased convenience without sacrificing taste or family togetherness. Saving bacon grease in a tin can was a ritual in every working kitchen. It sat on the back of the stove, lid popped open, ready to catch every drop of golden fat left behind after breakfast. Housewives did not waste what could be reused, especially not something as flavorful and versatile as bacon grease. It was their secret weapon for cooking eggs, frying potatoes, making gravy, or giving soups a richer taste. A spoonful could make bland vegetables taste indulgent. It was practically its own seasoning. The grease hardened as it cooled and would keep for weeks without going bad. You did not refrigerate it, you just trusted it. Bacon was not something eaten every day, but when you had it, you made it count. Even the drippings were valuable. Housewives taught their kids to pour it safely, and it was one of the first cooking lessons many daughters learned. You knew the home was cared for when you saw that tin. And if you brought it out for company, it meant you were serious about flavor. Today, we toss grease without thinking. But back then, bacon grease was pure kitchen gold. Nothing went to waste, not even the fat from your breakfast. Ketchup meat marinades were the unsung heroes of tough cuts. If the meat was chewy or on the edge of spoiling, ketchup was your best bet. Mixed with vinegar, onions, and sometimes a bit of sugar, it created a tangy brine that broke down fibers and gave the meat a richer taste. The acidity worked like magic, especially overnight in the icebox, or even just an hour before cooking. Frying or grilling after a ketchup soak gave the meat a caramelized crust and a deep savory flavor that covered up any flaws. It was a go-to for cheap steaks, pork scraps, and even liver. Some families added garlic or mustard, others kept it plain. Either way, it was dependable. You will not find this trick in high-end recipes or modern cookbooks, but it worked so well that it stayed in rotation for decades. Ketchup was more than a condiment. It was a tool, and for a lot of families, it turned subpar meat into something you actually looked forward to. Pickled beet eggs looked almost too strange to eat, but they were one of the smartest ways to stretch a protein that was hard to come by. Eggs were precious, and when you had a few on hand, preserving them meant you could enjoy them over days instead of one single meal. The trick was in the brine. You took leftover beet juice, usually from canned or boiled beets, added vinegar and some spices, and dropped peeled boiled eggs into the jar. After a few days, they turned bright pink and took on a tangy, earthy flavor that was far more interesting than a plain boiled egg. The color made them feel like a treat, especially to children who had not seen anything festive in months. These were served at room temperature, sometimes sliced onto bread or mashed into sandwiches. They could last for over a week in a cool place, which made them ideal for families without ice boxes. They were flavorful, pretty to look at, and most importantly, long-lasting. Pickled beet eggs were one of those strange depression dishes that did not just make do, but made something new. Celery salt on cottage cheese might not sound like much, but for mid-century dieters, it was a little miracle. In the 1950s, cottage cheese was hailed as the queen of health foods, low in fat, high in protein, and endlessly adaptable. But let us be honest, it was bland. Enter celery salt. Just a dash gave it a briny, herby kick that made the whole bowl come alive. It was cheap, shelf-stable, and sprinkled on everything from tomato slices to hard-boiled eggs. But with cottage cheese, it had a real glow-up. This combo became a go-to lunch for housewives watching their waistlines, often served on lettuce with half a pear or a canned peach on top. It looked like a diet plate, but tasted like something more satisfying. You could find this suggestion in health columns, diet booklets, and women's magazines from coast to coast. It was a trick born of scarcity and self-restraint, dressed up to feel like something fancier. Even today, a bite of cottage cheese with a little celery salt feels like stepping into a lunch counter from 70 years ago. Quiet, cool, and just a little strange. Butterscotch pudding. Icebox cups delighted families with a cool, creamy dessert that could be assembled in minutes and chilled until the end of dinner. Instant pudding mix, a relatively new marvel in the 1950s, required only milk and a quick whisk to thicken into a smooth custard. Housewives poured the mixture into paper cups or small glasses, sometimes topping each with a dollop of whipped cream or a few crushed cookies for extra flair. Because the cups could be made hours in advance or just before the meal, they offered flexibility for busy evenings or last-minute guests. The rich butterscotch flavor felt indulgent yet familiar, appealing to both children and adults who associated it with candy shop treats. This recipe became a staple for families who wanted a sweet ending without heating the oven or dirtying extra pans. Served cold straight from the icebox, the pudding cups represented the modern convenience and playful indulgence that defined many mid-century kitchens. Ice cube trays were more than just for ice. In the 1950s, housewives used them to portion and preserve homemade broth, leftover gravy, or any bit of soup that seemed too good to toss. Once frozen, those little cubes of flavor could be popped into a pot weeks later to bring life back into a stew, casserole, or skillet of vegetables. Chicken stock from a roast dinner? Poured it in. Leftover beef drippings mixed with water? Froze it too. This trick was both practical and brilliant. It kept meals from tasting bland and helped stretch flavor when seasonings were in short supply. Plus, it was a way to avoid spoilage without relying on bulky storage or wasting fridge space. Ice cube trays were cheap, easy to clean, and always handy. You knew you were doing things right when your freezer had a few trays filled with amber or golden broth. It made midweek cooking faster and tastier. Modern kitchens have gadgets for everything, but back then, a simple metal tray turned scraps into meal starters. Clever and quiet, this trick turned tiny cubes into powerful bursts of comfort and helped every meal feel just a bit more homemade. Cheese and olive toothpick bites added a touch of mid-century cocktail hour glamour to even the most casual get-together, proving that entertaining could be both quick and stylish. Small cubes of sharp cheddar or mild American cheese were skewered with firm green olives on wooden toothpicks, sometimes accented with a sliver of pimiento for extra color. The salty olives complemented the creamy richness of the cheese, creating a flavor combination that felt more sophisticated than the minimal effort required. Hostesses arranged the bites in concentric circles on gleaming platters, a presentation that looked impressive but took only minutes to assemble. Because the ingredients kept well in the refrigerator, they could be made at a moment's notice when neighbors dropped by or friends stayed after work. Guests appreciated the neat one-bite size that paired perfectly with both cocktails and coffee, and children enjoyed sneaking a few when adults were not looking. These little skewers embodied the era's belief that elegance and efficiency could happily share the same plate. Turning leftover oatmeal into muffins was a quiet revolution in the breakfast routine. Cold, sticky oatmeal from the morning pot often sat lonely on the stove. But 1950s housewives had no intention of throwing it out. Instead, they folded it into muffin batter with flour, sugar, eggs, and whatever fruit or spices were on hand. The result was moist, dense muffins that filled the kitchen with warmth. You could add raisins, apples, cinnamon, even nuts if you had some. No one at the table guessed it was yesterday's porridge. It became a treat, not a chore. and it stretched one meal into another with hardly any effort. The texture was satisfying, the flavor comforting, and the savings unspoken but deeply felt. Frugality met creativity here. Housewives did not just save food, they remade it. These muffins were humble but reliable. They showed up in lunchboxes, picnic baskets, and church bake sales. And each one carried the quiet message that nothing in this house gets wasted, not even cold oatmeal. Pan-toasting stale bread for crumb coating was not just clever, it was essential. You did not throw out old bread. You let it dry, you crumbled it with your fingers, and you tossed it into a hot skillet to toast. No oil, no butter, just dry heat. The smell alone was comforting, warm, nutty, toasty in a way that made you feel like something good was coming. Once browned, you could crush it finer and use it to coat fish, chicken, or vegetables before frying, or sprinkle it on casseroles to give them a crisp top layer. It gave texture and taste to anything soft or soggy. Kids who grew up on this trick remember the sound of that skillet scraping across the stovetop more than they remember store-bought breadcrumbs. Today, most people buy theirs in boxes, but those never taste quite the same. Pan-toasted crumbs were a small act of resourcefulness, born from the kind of hunger that made you see potential in every stale slice. Apple skin tea was what you made when even the scraps had scraps. In homes where nothing went to waste, apple peels left over from canning or pie making were gathered and boiled into a weak but fragrant tea. It smelled sweet like cider, even if the taste was faint. Sometimes people added cinnamon sticks or cloves, but most of the time it was just water and skins. Served hot, it warmed your hands and gave you the sense that you were drinking something more than water. In a time when every ingredient had to pull double duty, this was how you honored what little you had. Apple skin tea was often sipped at night after supper when the fire had burned low and the day's work was done. It was not about nourishment so much as comfort. A hot mug of anything in the Great Depression was an act of care. You felt it going down, slow and steady, and it reminded you that sweetness could still be coaxed from the barest leftovers. Mashed potato donuts were a wartime favorite that combined comfort, frugality, and just enough indulgence. They started as a way to use up leftover mashed potatoes, especially the cold, sticky kind no one wanted to reheat. Mixed with flour, sugar, eggs, and spices, the dough was rolled out, cut into rings, and fried until golden. The potatoes made them tender on the inside, with a crisp outer shell that held up well to a dusting of powdered sugar or a quick dip in glaze. The texture was somewhere between a cake donut and a fritter, and they were surprisingly filling. These showed up in cookbooks throughout the 1940s and 1950s, usually listed under budget baking or no-waste desserts. They were popular at church events, bake sales, and family breakfasts, where everyone needed something sweet and satisfying. People even used boxed instant mashed potatoes when real ones were in short supply. It was not just about saving money, it was about turning scraps into something worth looking forward to. And in kitchens where not a spoonful could be wasted, these donuts made every bite count. Sardine and celery canapés gave 1950s homemakers a way to serve a sophisticated bite without spending precious time in the kitchen. Canned sardines were mashed with finely chopped celery and a dash of lemon juice, creating a creamy yet crisp filling that could be spread on small squares of rye or wheat bread. The mixture provided a boost of protein and a briny flavor that felt upscale compared to typical sandwiches. Because the fish came ready to eat and the celery added instant freshness, the entire snack could be prepared during the time it took coffee to brew. Hostesses appreciated the elegant look of neatly arranged canapés on a platter, and guests were often surprised by how satisfying such a simple preparation could be. The contrast of the soft sardine spread and the crunch of fresh celery made every bite interesting. This quick recipe reflected the growing American taste for continental flavors while staying firmly rooted in the frugality and efficiency prized by housewives of the era. Stretching ground beef with rolled oats was not just frugal, it was necessary. Meat was pricey and often rationed, but families still needed protein on the plate. Instead of using a full pound of beef for meatloaf or burgers, housewives would mix in rolled oats. They soaked up flavor, added texture, and held the mixture together like a charm. You would never guess there was less meat. And if you seasoned it well, with onion, garlic, or even ketchup, it tasted like the full thing. Some even preferred it that way. It was healthier, heartier, and cheaper. This trick helped feed more mouths without sacrificing quality. You could get 6 burgers out of a half-pound of beef if you did it right. Housewives took pride in that. It was not about cutting corners. It was about making smart use of what you had. And in a time when every meal was cooked from scratch, that kind of ingenuity was respected. It made dinner stretch further, and everyone left the table full. Today we might call it a budget recipe. Back then, it was just how things were done, quietly clever and always thoughtful. Cast iron lid baking was born out of necessity and kept alive by sheer determination. When families had no access to an oven, or when it was too hot to fire one up, they made do with what they had. And what they had was a heavy cast iron pot, usually with a domed lid. Flip that lid over, set it on a flame, and you had a perfectly usable griddle surface for baking bannock, soda bread, or flat cakes. Some folks even propped up the lid with bricks and piled coals on top to create an improvised oven. It took practice to keep the heat even, but the reward was hot bread on a day you thought there would be none. This method showed up in everything from log cabins to war kitchens, and it never let people down. Cast iron held heat like nothing else, and when times got tough, it doubled as bakeware, skillet, and roasting pan. The lid was more than a cover, it was a secret weapon. These tricks rarely appear in modern books, but they kept people fed for generations. Salt-rubbed chicken skin crisping is one of those old-school tricks you try once and wonder why you ever stopped. Before nonstick pans and convection ovens, getting crispy skin was a real feat. One of the simplest ways to get there? Salt. Not a pinch, but a full rub down with coarse salt, left overnight in the fridge. It drew out moisture, dried the skin, and left it ready to blister and brown. You could add garlic or herbs if you had them, but you really did not need to. The trick worked best on whole chickens or thighs with the skin on. When it came out right, the skin cracked like a chip and packed serious flavor. Cookbooks from the 1940s through the 1970s praised it under crispy chicken secrets and roast tips. It took a little planning, sure, but the reward was worth it. And best of all, it cost nothing. Gravy over rice might sound like a side dish today, but in the 1930s, it was often the main event. When meat was scarce and vegetables were few, the leftover drippings from a roast, or even just some bacon grease and flour, got turned into gravy. Pour that over a pot of plain boiled rice, and suddenly you had dinner. It was salty, it was filling, and it used things that might otherwise go to waste. Gravy made even the blandest starch taste rich, and rice was a cheap staple that went a long way. Families would keep jars of fat and reuse every spoonful, sometimes adding a splash of milk or a bit of onion for extra depth. It was not about variety, it was about sustenance. One bowl of this could keep you full through a whole day's work, and that was all anyone hoped for. Some children grew up thinking this was a real meal, not realizing it was born of necessity. It was practical, thrifty, and as comforting as it was humbling. You did not need a feast. You just needed something hot, salty, and spoonable. Cold water pie crust was the kind of trick that did not need fancy words or modern instructions. You used flour, lard, a little salt, and water so cold it could numb your fingers. That was it. No refrigeration, no butter cubes, and definitely no food processor. Cooks would stir it just until it held together, then roll it thin and let it rest right on the countertop. The cold water kept the lard from melting too early, so when it hit the oven, the crust puffed and flaked just right. It was soft in the middle, crisp at the edges, and you could slice it clean even after it cooled. These pies were never about elegance. They were about making do, impressing no one but keeping the family full. That pie might hold stewed apples or onions and potatoes, or a mix of beans and leftover meat. Either way, it worked. You cannot find this in modern cookbooks because no one wants to talk about how powerful a glass of ice water and a bit of patience used to be. It was not glamorous, but it was genius. Saving butter wrappers for greasing pans was one of the quietest and cleverest habits in a 1950s kitchen. After using a stick of butter, a housewife would fold the wrapper neatly and store it in the fridge or freezer. When it came time to bake, she would pull it out and use the residue to coat cake tins, cookie sheets, or muffin trays. It gave just enough grease to keep things from sticking, no mess, no waste, and no need for extra butter. You were not wasting a thing. That small swipe of leftover fat did more than you would expect. It smelled like something was about to be baked, even before the oven warmed up. Housewives passed this trick down without thinking, and their daughters folded the wrappers just the same. It was a small act of thrift, but it came from a bigger mindset. Waste nothing, use everything. Even paper soaked in butter had a second life. In homes where every bit counted, even the wrapper had a job to do, and it did it well. Pineapple cottage cheese rings provided a quick balance of sweet and creamy flavors that fit perfectly into the health-conscious trends emerging in the post-war years. Thick slices of canned pineapple were drained and arranged on small plates, each ring crowned with a scoop of chilled cottage cheese. A sprinkle of paprika or finely chopped chives added a gentle kick and a pop of color that pleased the eye as much as the palate. The combination offered protein, fruit, and a touch of freshness with almost no preparation, making it a favorite for light lunches or afternoon snacks. Housewives served these rings when friends stopped by for coffee or as a cooling side dish during hot summer evenings. Children enjoyed the playful shape and the contrast between juicy pineapple and creamy cheese. This simple recipe embodied the 1950s belief that wholesome could also be beautiful, and demonstrated how a few pantry staples could create a dish that felt both modern and delightfully satisfying. Using evaporated milk as a cream substitute was an essential 1950s kitchen trick. Cream was expensive, spoiled fast, and was not always easy to find at the corner store. But evaporated milk came in a can, lasted forever, and delivered the richness housewives needed to whip up sauces, soups, and desserts. They would shake the can, open it, and pour it right into the pot like a secret ingredient. It thickened things beautifully and gave food that silky texture people usually only got at diners or supper clubs. It worked in coffee, mashed potatoes, fudge, even homemade ice cream, and it cost a fraction of what fresh cream did. Housewives swore by it, not because they had to, but because it worked. If you were lucky enough to have 2 cans, you could even whip it for pies or pudding toppings. It sounds like a hack today, but back then, it was just kitchen smarts. The pantry always had a few tucked away. In a time where smart substitutions meant the difference between skipping dessert or having something sweet, evaporated milk stepped in as the quiet hero. It made frugal feel fancy, and that mattered more than anyone let on. Flour and salt meat stretchers were not about taste. They were about survival and smart thinking. When a pound of meat had to feed 6 or 7 people, there was no room for waste. Home cooks would mix the meat with a cup or 2 of flour, sometimes seasoned with pepper or dried herbs, and add a heavy pinch of salt. That mixture got turned into patties, crumbles, or meatballs. The flour made it stick together, and the salt helped pull out the flavor from the scraps of beef or pork. Sometimes an egg was added, sometimes not. Fried in a pan or baked in a loaf tin, it held its shape and filled the plate. Kids did not ask what was in it. They were just glad to have a warm dinner with something meaty at the center. These stretchers kept food on the table long after the groceries had run out. You will not find this trick in today's glossy cookbooks. Nobody wants to admit that flour can make meat go twice as far, but ask anyone who lived through the hard years, and they will tell you it was a trick worth knowing. Fried cornmeal mush cakes were born from the same pot twice. You would make cornmeal mush, just cornmeal, water, maybe a pinch of salt, let it set in a pan overnight, and slice it into firm pieces the next day. Then you fried those slices in grease until the edges crisped up like polenta. It was crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside, and just enough to fool you into thinking you were eating something indulgent. Back in the 1930s, this was how you stretched a single meal into 2. The mush might have been dinner one night and breakfast the next morning. Some people served it with syrup or molasses, while others went savory and added onions or lard. There was no right or wrong. It was all about using what was left. You did not throw anything out, especially not a whole pot of cooled mush. It became a habit, a ritual, even a comfort. Children would dunk the crispy slices in milk or eat them straight from the pan. It was Depression-era cooking at its most honest. Plain ingredients, repurposed with care, turned into something worth looking forward to. Vinegar pie filling thickener was one of those odd tricks that worked better than it had any right to. Older fruit pies often came out runny, too sweet, or flat. A splash of vinegar helped in two ways. First, it cut the sugary taste and brought the fruit's brightness back. Second, it helped the flour or starch bind the filling together. Some even said it helped fruit hold its shape. You saw this most in old apple or berry pies, where just a teaspoon gave the flavor a sharp little kick. It was not something most people noticed, but if it was missing, you could tell. The sharp smell faded in the oven, leaving behind something more balanced. A clean slice, no leaks. Some tricks are bold. This one just did its job, and did it well. Homemade noodles made from just flour and water were a Depression staple that turned bare cupboards into something hearty. No eggs, no fancy tools, just a rolling pin, a knife, and some determination. Families would mix flour with water until it formed a stiff dough, then roll it thin and cut it into strips or shapes. The noodles were left to dry or boiled right away and dropped into soups, stews, or even just salted water. They soaked up flavor like a sponge, which was perfect when you had more broth than solids. Making noodles became a family affair, with children helping to roll and cut on floured tables. Sometimes people hung them over chairs or laid them out on dish towels to dry. It was messy work, but it filled time and bellies alike. When store-bought pasta was out of the question, these homemade versions stepped in proudly. They had chew, they had bite, and they gave even the thinnest broth some heft. It was food you made from almost nothing, and that always meant something. Salt rub for crispy chicken skin was the kind of trick that worked better than it had any right to. You rubbed coarse salt into the skin of a whole chicken, thighs, breasts, wings, everything, then let it rest overnight in the icebox uncovered. The salt drew out moisture, tightened the skin, and left it primed to blister and crackle in the oven the next day. No need for basting or fancy glaze, just dry heat and a little patience. When it roasted, the skin puffed and crisped like potato chips, golden and full of flavor. Underneath, the meat stayed juicy. Some cooks even added a bit of ground pepper or paprika to the salt rub for a touch of color and spice. That contrast, crispy on the outside, tender inside, was what people remembered most. This dry brining method was passed from one cook to the next without much fuss because it just worked. Modern cookbooks talk about air chilling or convection fans, but back then it was salt and time. And it never failed to earn a seat at the Sunday dinner table. Bacon and cheese waffle, which combined the novelty of frozen waffles with the timeless appeal of crisp bacon and melted cheese, creating a breakfast or lunch that felt both fun and filling. Pre-made waffles were quickly toasted until golden, then layered with strips of freshly cooked bacon and slices of mild cheddar before being pressed together like a sandwich. A short stint back on the hot waffle iron fused the layers into a warm, gooey package that could be eaten by hand. Housewives loved how the recipe transformed common breakfast items into something hearty enough for a midday meal, while requiring almost no cleanup. Children were thrilled by the playful idea of waffles outside of morning hours and the way the cheese stretched with every bite. The mix of sweet waffle edges and smoky bacon satisfied a wide range of tastes and showed how modern freezer products could simplify meal planning. This quick creation perfectly captured the inventive spirit of mid-century kitchens where efficiency and comfort happily met. Crushing stale cake into dessert crumbs was the final act of rescue in a house where nothing went to waste. When a cake dried out or sat too long on the counter, housewives did not toss it in the trash. They broke it up by hand or used a rolling pin to crush it into fine crumbs. Those crumbs had plenty of uses. You could press them into a pie crust with butter and sugar, sprinkle them over puddings, or layer them into trifles. Some folks even used them as coating for fried treats or folded them into new batter. It was sweet, crumbly insurance that dessert was never far away. Cake might have gone stale, but the love behind it had not. Housewives saw these bits as building blocks, not trash. A stale dessert became the start of another. That was the magic of mid-century homemaking. You found ways to keep flavor alive. Even in the smallest scraps, there was purpose. A pantry full of ideas meant a family full of surprises. No one ever guessed that the pie crust had once been a birthday cake. And that was the point. One-pan skillet cornbread shortcakes demonstrated how a basic Southern staple could be adapted into a speedy treat that satisfied a sweet craving without demanding a hot oven. Housewives stirred cornmeal, a little sugar, baking powder, milk, and an egg into a simple batter that could be poured into buttered muffin rings, set directly on a preheated skillet. The batter puffed and browned within minutes, creating tender cakes with crisp edges and a warm, nutty aroma. Served hot with a pat of butter or a drizzle of honey, they worked equally well for breakfast, an afternoon snack, or a quick dessert after supper. Their portability also made them perfect for children's lunches or a fast addition to a picnic basket. Because the recipe required only one pan and a few common ingredients, cleanup was minimal, a detail every busy homemaker valued. These shortcakes captured the blend of tradition and efficiency that defined mid-century kitchens, offering a taste of Southern comfort in a time frame that suited the modern post-war household. Jell-O as a leftover preserver may sound like a party trick today, but in the 1950s, it was a serious solution to a serious problem: food waste. Housewives would take leftover vegetables, bits of meat, or even chopped eggs and suspend them in flavored or plain gelatin. The result was a molded salad that kept longer and looked surprisingly elegant on the table. It was not about being fancy. It was about stretching a meal into the next day and keeping it safe without refrigeration on every corner. Jell-O sealed the food in and slowed spoilage, giving families another day or two to use it. You would chill the mold in a shallow dish, pop it out when company came over, and suddenly leftovers became a centerpiece. Some folks raised an eyebrow at ham and lime gelatin, but others swore by it. And when choices were few, you used what worked. Housewives did not flinch. They got creative. It was frugal, clever, and oddly festive. That wobble meant something back then. It meant no waste, full bellies, and a little color on a dinner table that needed cheering up. Dry mustard rubs were more than just a way to flavor meat. They were a quiet method of preservation long before refrigerators took over. A generous dusting of dry mustard, often mixed with salt, pepper, and a few pantry spices, was rubbed deep into cuts of pork, beef, or even game. The mix helped dry the surface, seal in juices, and gave the meat a subtle bite that came alive once cooked. These rubs worked especially well when meat had to be kept cool in a cellar or icebox and used over several days. For families who could not afford to let anything spoil, it was a little layer of safety and a whole lot of flavor. As the meat rested, the mustard acted like a protective barrier, especially in roasts or loins. When you finally cooked it, that seasoning had sunk in all the way through. Some even used mustard rubs before curing or smoking. These days, we rarely think about spices as preservers. We expect refrigeration to do the work. But back then, a tin of mustard powder was one of the most useful things in the pantry. Corncob broth proved that even what looked like trash still had a job to do. After eating the corn kernels, usually boiled or cut from the cob, people would save the cobs and toss them into a pot of water. Add a few onion peels or garlic skins, and you had the beginnings of a mild, slightly sweet broth. It was not strong, but it had body. You could use it as a soup base, to cook rice or beans, or even sip it hot with a pinch of salt. Some families swore it helped stretch out meals when nothing else was left. In many kitchens, this broth was a weekly ritual in summer when corn was in season. The cobs would sit in the pot all day, simmering slowly until they gave up their last bits of flavor. It was depression logic at its finest. Do not waste what you cannot replace. Even stripped bare, the cobs still had something left to give. This broth turned scraps into sustenance, and sustenance into a survival tool. Hot dog octopus garnish is what happens when creativity meets childhood joy. Mid-century party cookbooks, especially the ones aimed at birthday parties or school lunches, loved a good gimmick. and turning an ordinary hot dog into a smiling octopus? That was peak culinary fun for kids. The trick was simple. Slice one end of a hot dog into strips, boil it for a minute or two, and watch the legs curl outward like tentacles. The result was a goofy, wiggly hot dog that looked like it belonged in a cartoon and tasted like backyard summer. Parents would set them on top of mac and cheese, mashed potatoes, or even tuck them into lunchboxes with a smiley face drawn in mustard. It cost next to nothing but made kids feel like they were eating something special. These octopus dogs became so popular that some cookbooks devoted whole sections to fun food just like it. It was a different kind of food styling, one that made meals exciting without any fuss or frosting. And really, when you are 5 years old, who would not love a sea creature made of meat? Dough fluffing with vinegar and baking soda was one of those chemistry tricks that made you feel like a magician in the kitchen. No eggs? No problem. A splash of vinegar in your batter, mixed with baking soda, gave just enough lift to make pancakes, muffins, or quick breads rise like they had all the right ingredients. It fizzed as soon as you stirred it in, and you had to work fast. Those bubbles did not last forever. But if you timed it right, you got a tender crumb and a soft center without needing eggs or even milk. It was a lifesaver when rationing hit or when payday was still a few days away. Vinegar was cheap, baking soda was shelf-stable, and together they turned nothing into something. Modern recipes tend to leave this out, pushing people toward eggs or dairy substitutes. But vinegar and soda were the real original hack. They worked quietly, without a fuss, and gave families hot breakfasts and passable cakes even in the leanest times. Pan-toasting stale bread for crumb coating was not just clever, it was essential. You did not throw out old bread. You let it dry, you crumbled it with your fingers, and you tossed it into a hot skillet to toast. No oil, no butter, just dry heat. The smell alone was comforting, warm, nutty, toasty in a way that made you feel like something good was coming. Once browned, you could crush it finer and use it to coat fish, chicken, or vegetables before frying, or sprinkle it on casseroles to give them a crisp top layer. It gave texture and taste to anything soft or soggy. Kids who grew up on this trick remember the sound of that skillet scraping across the stovetop more than they remember store-bought breadcrumbs. Today, most people buy theirs in boxes, but those never taste quite the same. Pan-toasted crumbs were a small act of resourcefulness, born from the kind of hunger that made you see potential in every stale slice. Egg salad, stuffed tomatoes brought garden freshness to the table with a clever presentation that looked elegant without extra work. Hard-boiled eggs were quickly chopped and mixed with mayonnaise, mustard, and a pinch of salt to create a creamy salad. Plump tomatoes were cored and hollowed to form natural cups that cradled the filling, turning an everyday mixture into a dish fit for a luncheon or afternoon tea. Because both eggs and tomatoes were inexpensive and widely available, this recipe became a staple for families seeking a light but satisfying meal. Housewives appreciated how the cool salad contrasted with the juicy tomato walls, creating a refreshing bite ideal for warm evenings when turning on the stove was unwelcome. Guests admired the colorful presentation, and children often enjoyed eating the tomato shells like bowls. With only a few minutes of effort, this simple combination turned common staples into a dish that looked far more elaborate than its humble ingredients suggested. Wrapping sandwiches in wax paper rolls was the go-to method for packing love into a lunch. Plastic bags were not always around, and foil was saved for the big stuff. So housewives would roll sandwiches tightly in wax paper, sometimes tying them off with twine or ribbon. It kept the bread fresh and the filling in place, and when unwrapped, the sandwich still looked crisp, not smushed. It was part presentation, part preservation. A school lunch wrapped this way looked neat and thoughtful. For working husbands and school children alike, it was a small sign that someone had taken time to make lunch right. Wax paper had a soft crackle that was almost comforting to unfold. It did not sweat, it did not stick, and it could be tucked right back into a lunch pail when done. In an age before single-use plastics ruled the kitchen, this was the gold standard. It was clean, smart, and just a little sentimental. Gravy powder from pan scrapings was the kind of invention that came from hunger and a good sense of timing. After roasting or frying, the browned bits at the bottom of the pan were never wasted. They were scraped, dried slowly in the oven or near the stove, and then ground into a coarse powder that could last for weeks. A spoonful stirred into hot water gave you instant gravy, no bouillon cubes, no jars, no packets. It tasted real because it was. That powder held the memory of every meal it came from: roast chicken, seared chops, bacon ends. Some cooks even mixed it with flour and lard to make little gravy starter balls, ready to go at a moment's notice. The flavor was deep, smoky, and hard to pin down because it came from life, not a label. Today, we throw those scrapings away. We clean pans too quickly. But back then, this was the best part. It turned yesterday's effort into tomorrow's comfort. Old-fashioned corn pudding was sweet, soft, and surprisingly hearty, especially for something that came from such humble beginnings. In the 1930s, cornmeal was dirt cheap and endlessly useful, and this dish was one of the cleverest ways to turn it into a filling side: a bit of cornmeal, water or milk, and just enough sugar to make it feel special. Eggs were sometimes added, but often it was just flour, grease, and corn. It came out like a custard or a thick bread pudding, depending on what you had. Baked slowly, it developed a crust on top and a warm, spoonable inside that made it a family favorite. People would eat it hot out of the oven or cold the next morning, sometimes drizzled with molasses or a pat of margarine. It was both side dish and dessert, depending on your mood. There were no store-bought sweets for most folks back then, so corn pudding gave just enough sugar and softness to count as a treat. And for children, it was a rare bite of comfort in a world where food often felt like medicine. It was poor man's pudding, but it tasted like something richer. Cornflake coating for fried foods was one of those budget miracles that came out of a box. When breadcrumbs were scarce or you just wanted something different, people turned to cornflakes, those same flakes they poured in a bowl for breakfast each morning. Crushed into fine crumbs and tossed with a little salt or paprika, cornflakes made a crunchy, golden coating that worked on everything from chicken to pork chops to fish sticks. You did not need a deep fryer either, just a baking tray, a little oil, and a hot oven. Some versions used a milk and egg wash first, while others went straight from the cornflake crumbs to the pan. The coating crisped up quickly and stayed put, giving each bite a satisfying crunch. This trick was especially common in the 1950s and 1960s, when convenience met creativity and boxed cereals found their way into more than just the breakfast table. Kids loved it, adults called it clever, and it quietly became one of the best shortcuts in the American kitchen. Even gluten-free folks today still swear by it. The box said breakfast, but old cookbooks knew better. Jell-O whipped fruit parfait offered a colorful dessert that felt festive even on an ordinary evening, and it came together in record time thanks to the convenience of instant gelatin. A packet of flavored gelatin was dissolved in hot water and then chilled just until slightly thick before evaporated milk was whipped in to create a pale, frothy base. Housewives layered this creamy mixture with canned fruit cocktail or sliced bananas in clear glasses so every ribbon of color showed through. The result looked like something from a fancy restaurant, yet could be assembled between supper and the arrival of guests for cards or coffee. Children watched in delight as the layers jiggled and shimmered, and adults admired the light texture that melted on the tongue without being overly sweet. Because it needed only a brief chill, it was ideal for those moments when dessert was forgotten until the last minute. This quick treat captured the optimistic spirit of the 1950s, when convenience products promised elegance without effort, and every meal could end on a sparkling note. Turning stale bread into homemade croutons was one of the simplest yet smartest tricks in a 1950s kitchen. Bread never lasted forever, especially before preservatives became the norm. But a housewife would never let a loaf go to waste. Instead, she would cut it into cubes, drizzle with a bit of oil or bacon grease, toss in whatever seasoning she had on hand, and bake until crisp. These croutons were then stored in jars and added to soups, casseroles, or salads for days to come. They brought crunch, comfort, and a sense of creativity to any meal. You did not need to buy anything new, just make the old new again. Kids loved them, husbands noticed them, and guests thought they were fancy. All from a slice that might have otherwise gone to the birds. It was a perfect example of homemaking in the 1950s, clever, quiet, and deeply practical. Housewives learned to turn a potential waste into a winning side dish, and the smell of toasting bread with a hint of garlic or butter, that alone could bring the whole family to the kitchen. Today, we buy croutons in boxes. Back then, we made them from scraps, with pride. Boiled apple core pectin for jams was a brilliant example of how nothing went to waste, not even the parts most of us toss. When you peeled apples for pies, sauces, or snacks, you saved the cores and skins in a pot. Add water, bring it to a boil, and simmer it down until it became thick and sticky. That cloudy, pale liquid was pure pectin, the natural thickener that made your jams and jellies set without extra sugar or gelatin. You strained it through a cloth and saved it in jars, ready to add to the next batch of strawberry preserves or grape jelly. This trick gave structure to homemade spreads and let families stretch their fruit harvest further. It also meant that one bag of apples could serve 3 or 4 purposes, not just one. Store-bought pectin became popular later, but for many years, this was the only kind you had. The trick worked best with tart apples, especially those a little underripe. It is barely mentioned now, but it was once as essential as sugar itself in rural kitchens. Lima bean stew was one of those one-pot miracles that got families through the leanest stretches of the 1930s. Dried lima beans were cheap, easy to store, and when soaked and cooked slowly, they turned creamy and rich. Families would simmer them all day with scraps of carrot, onion, or potato, whatever they could find. If they had bacon grease or lard, a spoonful added body. If not, salt and thyme would do the job. There was no recipe, just instinct and adaptation. Sometimes the beans were mashed into a thick paste, sometimes left whole and floating in broth. The stew could stretch over 2 or even 3 days, especially if you kept adding water or leftover vegetables. Kids might complain, but mothers knew. This pot was the difference between full and hungry. In many homes, the smell of beans bubbling away was a kind of comfort. It meant there would be something to eat tonight. It was frugal food with just enough warmth to feel like dinner. In hard times, lima bean stew taught you patience, resourcefulness, and the power of cooking what you had, not what you wished for. Boiled salad dressing was the grandmother of everything that came before the grocery aisle. Back before bottled ranch or ready-made vinaigrettes, home cooks whipped up dressings from scratch using what they had in the pantry. This particular one was a little tangy, a little sweet, and usually started with vinegar, sugar, egg yolks, and a bit of mustard powder. Everything was whisked together in a saucepan and cooked low until it thickened like a custard. The result was creamy and tart, perfect for potato salad, coleslaw, or even spooned over hard-boiled eggs. Some versions added flour or cornstarch to help it hold better in the fridge, while others kept it simple. It might not have had the smooth pour of modern dressings, but it had soul and a flavor people still remember. You would find it tucked into the back pages of church cookbooks, labeled Grandma's Dressing or Sweet Egg Sauce. When chilled, it firmed up a little, which made it ideal for picnic salads that had to last in the summer sun. It tasted like resourcefulness, it tasted like memory, and it was surprisingly good. These quick dishes turned simple pantry finds into dinners in a flash. How many of those clever secrets have quietly disappeared from our kitchens? Ham and pineapple toasties brought the bright sweetness of canned pineapple together with the smoky salt of sliced ham, creating a quick dish that looked elegant enough for unexpected guests while needing only minutes under the broiler. Housewives of the 1950s prized anything that could be made in 10 minutes, yet still feel special when set on the table for friends arriving after church or for a late afternoon bridge club snack. The pineapple rings came straight from the pantry, while the thin ham slices were usually left over from a weekend roast, making the recipe economical as well as fast. A simple white bread base toasted golden provided crunch and stability, while a light brushing of prepared mustard added a tang that balanced the fruit. Broiling for a few minutes melted the flavors together and filled the kitchen with a sweet, savory aroma that hinted of tropical getaways many homemakers only dreamed about. Children loved the contrast of warm fruit and salty meat, and adults enjoyed the effortless elegance that turned a weekday into a small celebration. Cold water pie crust was the kind of trick that did not need fancy words or modern instructions. You used flour, lard, a little salt, and water so cold it could numb your fingers. That was it. No refrigeration, no butter cubes, and definitely no food processor. Cooks would stir it just until it held together, then roll it thin and let it rest right on the countertop. The cold water kept the lard from melting too early, so when it hit the oven, the crust puffed and flaked just right. It was soft in the middle, crisp at the edges, and you could slice it clean even after it cooled. These pies were never about elegance. They were about making do, impressing no one but keeping the family full. That pie might hold stewed apples or onions and potatoes, or a mix of beans and leftover meat. Either way, it worked. You cannot find this in modern cookbooks because no one wants to talk about how powerful a glass of ice water and a bit of patience used to be. It was not glamorous, but it was genius. In the 1930s, these simple meals made the difference between going hungry and getting by. What did we lose when we stopped cooking like this? Rendered bacon grease was one of those things every household in the 1930s held on to like it was gold. When you could not afford fresh butter or oil, the fat left over from breakfast bacon became your miracle ingredient. After the skillet cooled, people would scrape the drippings into jars and stash them away for everything: beans, biscuits, gravy, cornbread, even cooked vegetables. It was smoky, salty, and rich, and it turned even plain cabbage or boiled potatoes into something comforting. If you were lucky enough to have some cracklings left in the mix, all the better. Bacon itself was a luxury, but the grease stretched that flavor over a dozen meals. Nothing went to waste, not even the fat in the pan. Families would pass these jars down week to week like heirlooms, and it was not uncommon for a mother to teach her child exactly when the grease was good and when it had gone off. It kept things edible, and in a lot of homes, it kept the whole meal together. It is not just a trick. It was a survival tactic that added flavor when seasoning was a distant dream. A spoonful of bacon grease could mean the difference between bland and bearable. Once swore by, then stopped using, they got meals on the table fast, cheap, and with whatever was on hand. But what happens when we try them again, in a kitchen that's moved on? Potato chip casserole topping was one of those strange little tricks that somehow made dinner feel like a treat. Back in the day, people did not have access to fancy breadcrumbs or crunchy imported cheeses, and boxed mixes were still a novelty. But they almost always had a bag of plain potato chips sitting around, maybe a little stale, maybe half-eaten, maybe on sale. So when it came time to top a casserole, instead of breadcrumbs or fried onions, cooks reached for that crinkled bag, crushed it up in their hands, and sprinkled the pieces across the top. Into the oven it went, and out came something golden, salty, and unexpectedly satisfying. That simple potato chip crust made otherwise bland casseroles feel indulgent, and the trick was proudly passed down in community cookbooks, church bulletins, and lunchroom chatter. It was cheap, it was crunchy, and best of all, it used something people already had. There were even recipes that told you to mix the crushed chips with melted margarine or powdered cheese before baking, because if you were going to commit to a topping, you might as well go all in. There is just something so right about a casserole with a potato chip crown. Creamed peas on buttered saltines turned humble ingredients into a comforting snack that fit perfectly into the fast-paced rhythm of a mid-century kitchen. A can of peas simmered briefly with evaporated milk and a spoon of flour thickened into a silky sauce, while salted crackers were quickly buttered and warmed in the oven. The result was a bite that married the soft sweetness of peas with the crisp snap of a cracker and the richness of melted butter, a texture that felt both homey and indulgent. Housewives favored this recipe when the pantry was sparse, but an afternoon visitor required something hot to serve alongside tea or coffee. Because everything came from the shelf, it required no trip to the market, a blessing for women juggling children, chores, and unexpected company. The mild flavor also made it popular with children who sometimes turned their share into playful towers before devouring them. Simple yet satisfying, it showcased how creative cooks could transform everyday staples into something memorable in less than 10 minutes. Buttered radish toast presented a simple yet surprisingly refined snack that highlighted the crisp bite of fresh radishes against the richness of warm bread and creamy butter. Housewives sliced firm radishes paper-thin and arranged them in overlapping circles on thick slices of freshly toasted bread generously spread with soft butter. A light sprinkle of salt drew out the radish's peppery flavor and added a satisfying crunch. The combination offered a refreshing change from heavier midday fare, making it a popular choice for quick lunches or afternoon teas. Because radishes were inexpensive and easy to grow in backyard gardens, many families enjoyed this treat straight from their own harvest. The vivid contrast of white bread, red radish edges, and pale butter created a visual appeal that felt elegant without extra cost or effort. Served alongside a cup of tea or a small bowl of soup, it became a charming reminder that the simplest ingredients could create memorable flavors when treated with care and attention. Refrigerator pickling with vinegar and sugar was how housewives brought a little brightness into their meals without a full day of canning. You sliced cucumbers, onions, or even green beans, poured over a hot mix of vinegar, sugar, and spices, then sealed the jar and let it chill. No boiling water baths, no pressure cookers, just patience and a fridge shelf. In a day or two, you had sweet, tangy pickles that added snap and flavor to otherwise plain meals. They stayed crisp, looked colorful, and made sandwiches or roasts feel like something special. Best of all, it gave you control. You adjusted the sweetness, spiced it your way, and worked with whatever was in season. Refrigerator pickling felt homemade, but also modern. It was fast enough for weeknight dinners, but classic enough to impress guests. This trick helped housewives stay ahead, turning garden extras or produce drawer stragglers into little jars of joy. In a world where nothing was wasted, pickling meant preservation, not just taste. And every time you opened the fridge to that tangy scent, it felt like a little reward for doing things the smart way. Homemade rennet for cheesemaking was not for the faint of heart, but it got the job done. Before tablets and store-bought cultures, people used what they had, often vinegar, lemon juice, or for the brave ones, a bit of calf stomach lining. The process was part science, part tradition. You warmed milk gently, stirred in the curdling agent, and waited for the magic to happen. Once it separated into curds and whey, you strained it through cloth and pressed it into soft rounds or blocks. Some added salt or herbs, others kept it plain. The taste was fresh, a little tangy, and deeply rewarding. It was not just about saving money, it was about knowing how to make food from the ground up. Today's cookbooks mostly skip this, expecting readers to start with pre-made cheese or kits. But the old method taught patience and respect for the process. Cheese was no longer something you bought, it was something you made. Molasses milk was poor man's cocoa, and for many families it was the closest thing to a sweet treat they could manage. All it took was a splash of hot milk, sometimes powdered, sometimes fresh, and a spoonful of molasses stirred in. The result was dark, rich, and full of iron, with a strong flavor that kids either loved or learned to tolerate. It had warmth, it had sweetness, and it came with none of the cost of chocolate, which had all but vanished from most households during the 1930s. Molasses was one of the most common sweeteners at the time because it was cheaper than sugar and had a longer shelf life. It also felt hearty, like something that was doing your body good, even if the cupboard was nearly empty. Some families drank this before bed, others served it in place of breakfast. It was a quiet comfort, often ladled out in chipped mugs, handed off with a tired smile and a reminder to sip slowly. Molasses milk might not sound glamorous today, but back then, it tasted like safety. And that was worth more than anything else. Whipped evaporated milk for desserts was the poor man's whipped cream, and for some, it tasted even better. It came in a can, sat on the shelf for months, and was far cheaper than real cream. To make it work, you chilled the can, poured the thick milk into a bowl, and whipped it hard. Some added sugar or vanilla, but it held its shape without much help. It was not as rich as real cream, but it held firm and had a clean, milky flavor. People used it in mousses, icebox cakes, and pies that needed lift without weight. It popped up in retro cookbooks as a budget topping or emergency fix. During rationing or tight weeks, it was a go-to solution. And for families who grew up with it, the taste still brings back birthdays, bake sales, and simple Sunday treats. Instant tapioca custard cups captured the thrill of modern convenience with a dessert that seemed elegant despite being ready in minutes. Pearl tapioca simmered gently in sweetened milk until translucent and thick, creating a base that was smooth yet delightfully textured. Beaten egg yolks were whisked in near the end for a gentle richness, while a splash of vanilla provided a warm aroma that drifted through the kitchen. Housewives spooned the custard into small cups and set them in the refrigerator, where they cooled quickly enough to serve after supper without hours of waiting. The tiny pearls offered a playful pop that fascinated children, while adults savored the silky creaminess. Because the ingredients were inexpensive and kept well in the pantry, it became a reliable last-minute dessert for unexpected guests or sudden cravings. Served plain or with a sprinkling of grated nutmeg, it brought a touch of old-fashioned charm to the modern mid-century table and showcased how quick cooking products could create something memorable and delicious. Canned fruit cocktail as a dessert base was the sweet secret at the end of many 1950s meals. With real fruit hard to keep fresh and budget stretched thin, those little syrupy cans were a godsend. Cherries, pears, peaches, grapes, all diced and ready to pour. Housewives would layer the fruit with whipped cream, gelatin, or cottage cheese to create something that looked fancy and felt indulgent. It was easy, fast, and colorful. Kids loved it, husbands asked for seconds, and guests never complained. These desserts came together with minimal effort but plenty of flair. You might call it ambrosia, fluff, or just fruit salad, but it was more than the sum of its parts. A few spoonfuls brought color to a beige dinner and comfort to tired families. These cans lined pantry shelves like promise in a tin. Whether topped with shredded coconut, marshmallows, or a dollop of cream, the cocktail did its job well. And it did so with the kind of quiet reliability that defined homemaking in the 1950s. Egg white paint for pie crust shine was the kind of kitchen trick passed down without words, just by watching someone do it. Before you had glossy photos in cookbooks or pre-made pastry shells, a good pie was known by its crust. And nothing made that crust sing like a simple swipe of beaten egg white. It gave a golden sheen, a crisp snap when bitten, and just enough polish to make it feel like a special occasion. No butter wash, no fancy glaze, just a leftover egg white, whisked and brushed on with a fingertip or scrap of cloth. It was used on both sweet and savory pies, and sometimes even on biscuits or rolls for that bakery look. You could even sprinkle sugar or seeds on top, and the egg white would help it stick. Today's recipes might tell you to use milk or yolk, but the old cooks knew egg whites gave the cleanest, crispest finish. It was quiet elegance from a cupboard that had very little to give. Country chicken and gravy is pretty much as South as you can get. It's always been a staple up there, and for good reason too. There aren't many things that go this well with corn, green beans, buttermilk biscuits, and mashed potatoes. That pretty much covers the extent of the sides available in the South anyway. Jokes aside, it's one of the healthiest recipes to keep in your rotation and a great one to include if you're trying to see some gains at the gym. It's simple enough, takes little work, and on top of that, you end up with something that you can pair up with just about anything. This is also why a lot of grandmas chose this recipe and why it got so popular. You could pretty much always work with what you had and not have to go on a grocery trip just to make the recipe work. If one day you didn't have beans, you could always just go for mashed potatoes. If you were feeling a bit more celebratory, you could even go all out and bake an apple pie to go with it. There wasn't any shortage of combinations that this recipe worked with. This is probably no surprise to a lot of people who grew up having mac and cheese at their grandma's house or from a street cart down the block. Just a little bit of mustard in your mac and cheese can do wonders for taking an already perfect dish and kicking it up several notches, but the question is, why? What does mustard do to mac and cheese that makes this pairing so irresistible that every vendor, grandma, and home chef from the Midwest to the northern areas tries it? It is because the acidity of the mustard really helps cut through all the fat in the macaroni and cheese and blends together with the flavor already there. You can find this in just about any grocery store too if you check the back of the box. Classic Dijon or yellow mustard adds that tang that makes your mac and cheese shine and stand out. Breadcrumb stuffing without meat was not just a holiday thing in the 1930s, it was a year-round filler. When families had no sausage, no giblets, and sometimes no roast at all, they would take stale bread, tear it up, and moisten it with water or broth. If you had a little onion or celery, that went in too. The whole mess got baked until crisp on top and soft inside, and it tasted like something far fancier than it was. This was depression cooking at its cleverest. The trick was to use whatever you had to stretch the meal. Sometimes the bread was barely held together with a bit of egg or flour paste. Sometimes it was just bread, salt, and hope. But it filled bellies, and that was what mattered most. People called it stuffing, even if there was nothing to stuff. It would sit in the center of the table like a roast if need be. Some families even sliced it cold the next day and fried it up like savory cake. It was warm, it was simple, and it helped people feel like they still had something special to share. That was the magic of it. Plain food pretending to be more. Mayonnaise as a cake moistener sounds like a cruel joke until you taste it. In the lean years, especially during the Great Depression and into the war era, people had to get creative when they were short on eggs, milk, or butter. Mayonnaise was made with all three, and it had a smooth, fatty texture that blended beautifully into batter. So when folks wanted to bake a cake but the fridge was bare, they reached for the mayo jar. Chocolate mayonnaise cake became a sleeper hit, especially in mid-century kitchens. It was rich, dark, and impossibly moist, with a texture that stayed soft even days after baking. Cookbooks started including mayo cakes as their own category, with variations that included nuts, cinnamon, or even applesauce. Brands caught on too. Some even printed the recipe on the side of their jars. You could always tell someone grew up during hard times if they looked at a cake and guessed the secret ingredient right away. To this day, some home bakers still swear it is the only way to make a chocolate cake that never dries out. Strange as it sounds, mayonnaise made cakes better, and no one questioned it. Chocolate marshmallow fudge, Squares satisfied sweet cravings with a melt-in-the-mouth richness that required only a stovetop and a brief chill, a true miracle for a generation discovering the joys of quick desserts. Housewives melted chocolate chips with a splash of evaporated milk and a bit of butter, then folded in miniature marshmallows until they softened slightly without losing their shape. The warm mixture was poured into a buttered pan and set in the refrigerator where it firmed within minutes. The result was a smooth, chewy fudge dotted with soft marshmallow pockets that delighted both children and adults. Because the recipe required no careful temperature monitoring or candy thermometer, it was nearly foolproof and ideal for spontaneous treats or last-minute gifts. Neighbors often received small plates wrapped in wax paper as a gesture of friendship, and children carried squares in their lunchboxes as a special surprise. This quick confection captured the 1950s embrace of convenience foods while delivering old-fashioned homemade flavor in record time. Using cookie cutters for sandwich appeal was a trick every clever 1950s housewife kept in her back pocket. Lunches could be plain, but they did not have to look it. With just a press of a cutter, a square slice of bread turned into a star, a heart, or a teddy bear. Suddenly, that same old peanut butter and jelly became a little surprise tucked into a lunchbox. It was not just for kids either. Bridal showers, garden teas, and baby luncheons all saw trays of shaped finger sandwiches stacked just so. Even ham on white looked fancier when cut into circles and layered like petals. This trick was all about charm without extra cost. You used what you had and added care. It gave lunch a little lift And for children in school or husbands at work, that small delight meant something. Housewives knew food was about more than hunger. It was about comfort, joy, and effort. A cookie cutter was not just a baking tool. It was a reminder that home cooking came from the heart, right down to the edges of the crust. Wilted lettuce salad was not just about saving soggy greens. It was about making the most of what the garden gave, even past its prime. When lettuce started to wilt in the heat or after a few days indoors, families did not toss it. Instead, they poured hot bacon grease mixed with vinegar over the top, reviving the leaves into something tender and flavorful. The heat wilted the lettuce just enough, and the vinegar gave it a punch of brightness. Bits of onion or crumbled bacon were added when possible, but the core of the dish was that sizzling pour. It turned tired lettuce into a warm salad with more depth than any cold dressing could offer. You did not need much to make it feel special. It was a moment when something old felt new again. In a time of extreme frugality, it captured the mindset perfectly. Do not throw it out. Just use it differently. Wilted lettuce was not a fallback. It was a quiet trick that helped people feel like they still had a choice at the table. Leftover cereal meat coating was a trick that came straight from the back of the box. When breadcrumbs were out and cornflakes had already gone into yesterday's casserole, cooks got creative with whatever dry cereal they had left. Bran flakes, crisped rice, even plain puffed wheat. They were all crushed, seasoned, and pressed into service as a meat coating. The idea was to roll a cutlet or drumstick in milk or egg, then dredge it through crushed cereal to make a crunchy crust. It was cheaper, often healthier, and surprisingly effective. Some people added parmesan or paprika to the mix to boost the flavor, while others liked the sweetness it brought to pork or chicken. Kids never questioned it, especially if the cereal had been part of breakfast just that morning. These tricks were passed down in hand-me-down cookbooks and on recipe cards that started with, "Use what you have." And that is really what it was about, making dinner work without running to the store. Sometimes the best recipes came from the bottom of the box. Peanut butter banana milkshake gave families a frosty treat that doubled as a quick source of energy on busy days. Ripe bananas were blended with creamy peanut butter, cold milk, and a spoon of malted milk powder until thick and smooth. Housewives loved that it used fruit that might otherwise go to waste while delivering a protein-rich drink that satisfied hungry children returning from school. The natural sweetness of the bananas meant no extra sugar was necessary, and the malted powder added a nostalgic soda fountain flavor without the need to leave home. Because it required only a blender and a few pantry staples, the shake was ready before the ice cream man reached the end of the street. Parents enjoyed it as a light breakfast on hot mornings, while children begged for it as an after-dinner dessert. In less than 10 minutes, this recipe transformed simple ingredients into a creamy indulgence that felt both wholesome and festive, a perfect reflection of the inventive spirit of 1950s home kitchens. Reusing cereal bag liners as wax paper was a kitchen trick hiding in plain sight. Once the kids had torn through their cornflakes or puffed rice, housewives would carefully remove the inner plastic liner, shake out the crumbs, and set it aside. This waxy, crinkly paper was not trash. It was an all-purpose kitchen tool. You could wrap sandwiches in it, cover leftovers, line cake pans, or even roll out pie dough without sticking. It was durable, clean, and, best of all, completely free. In the 1950s, every penny saved counted, and this clever reuse was like a quiet rebellion against waste. Homemakers found dozens of ways to repurpose what others might throw out. It was a lesson in resourcefulness, not just frugality. If you grew up during that time, you probably remember the sound of those liners being folded and tucked away in a drawer. That crinkle was the sound of a house being run right. Modern kitchens may have parchment and plastic wraps galore, but nothing beats the feeling of giving something a second life. In a way, cereal bags were just another example of how every part of the home was expected to pull its weight, even the packaging. Potato boil water for gravy base is one of those tricks that feels too simple to matter, until you taste it. When you boil potatoes, the water turns cloudy and thick with starch. Most people pour it down the drain, but the old cooks saved it. That cloudy water was liquid gold, perfect for thickening gravies, stews, or even making a quick roux without needing butter or flour. It added body and just a hint of potato flavor, which paired beautifully with meat scraps or leftover vegetables. It was warm, filling, and somehow made everything else taste richer. You could stir in pan drippings or a spoonful of mustard or vinegar and have something that passed for a real sauce. Nothing fancy, but deeply satisfying. This trick barely shows up in cookbooks today, even though it worked better than some of the thickeners you find on store shelves. It was a quiet skill, one you learned by watching, not by reading, and once you knew it, you never threw out potato water again. Soup jar layering was what you did when the fridge was filled with almost empty pots and bowls. It wasn't a fancy technique, it was survival with a creative twist. When you had a little bit of leftover vegetable soup, a spoonful of bean chili, half a cup of chicken noodle, and a ladle of creamy tomato, you didn't throw any of it out. You poured them, one on top of the other, into a glass jar. The layers formed colorful stripes: green, red, yellow, beige. Some families even called it striped stew. Once the jar was full, it went into the fridge. And when it was time to reheat, you dumped the whole thing into a pot and stirred gently over low heat. The flavors blended, clashed, or occasionally surprised you. Sometimes you discovered a new favorite. Other times, it just tasted like Thursday. But it always felt thrifty. Each jar was a record of the week's meals: what was served, what was saved, and what was never wasted. In homes where food stretched far and memories were short, these jars did more than hold soup. They told a story, and in their quiet, unglamorous way, they made the most of everything. Celery and onion soup was bare bones, but it comforted. In homes where meat was missing and vegetables were gone by midweek, all you had were scraps. Celery tops, onion peels, maybe a clove of garlic. These simmered in water for hours, making broth that tasted better than expected. If you had grease or drippings, they went in. Bread crusts were added for body, and sometimes a bit of flour thickened it. The smell was half the meal, a warm scent that made you think something grand was cooking. But the truth was simpler. You were eating what others threw out. Still, in the 1930s, this was cooking smart. It gave warmth, flavor, and one more night of feeling okay. Bread crust pie lattice was the ultimate make-do solution for bakers who hated to waste a single scrap. Instead of tossing out the crusts from sliced sandwich bread, especially the heels, home cooks braided or layered them across the top of a pie. You would soak the crusts briefly in a little milk or brush them with melted butter to soften them up, then shape them into rustic strips. They would toast up golden in the oven and give the pie a rough, homemade charm that you just could not fake. It was not flaky like traditional crust, but it held its shape and added a chewy, buttery layer to each slice. This trick showed up in Depression era and wartime cookbooks as a way to conserve flour, since making a second crust from scratch was not always an option. It worked best on fruit pies or pudding pies that needed a topping but did not require full coverage. You would be surprised how many old-timers still remember this with a kind of fondness, those scrappy little pies made with crusts no one wanted. And the best part? It actually tasted pretty good. Maple-glazed breakfast apples provided a warm and fragrant side dish that brightened any morning without keeping the cook tied to the stove. Thick slices of tart apples were sautéed in butter until lightly caramelized, then drizzled with real maple syrup and a splash of lemon juice for balance. The fruit softened quickly, releasing a sweet aroma that mingled with the richness of the butter and the earthy scent of maple. Housewives often served these apples alongside pancakes, waffles, or simple scrambled eggs, adding a note of indulgence to an ordinary weekday. Children loved spooning the glossy slices over hot cereal, while adults enjoyed them as a topping for toast or even as a light dessert after dinner. Because the recipe called for only a skillet and a few pantry staples, it could be made on a whim whenever fresh apples were on hand. This quick dish reflected the 1950s enthusiasm for wholesome flavors combined with modern speed, giving every breakfast table a cozy yet efficient touch. Wax paper pie crust rolling was a small, neat miracle in every baker's routine. The trick was simple. Place dough between 2 sheets of wax paper, then roll it flat without ever touching the counter. No flour clouds, no sticking, no cleaning up bits of dough from every corner. It made rolling faster and neater and helped keep the crust light. Housewives found that pie dough came out more even, less dry, and easy to lift into the pan without tearing. Wax paper acted like a gentle buffer, holding everything in place and making cleanup a breeze. In a kitchen where mess meant more work and time was precious, this trick was a quiet revolution. You did not need a fancy mat or special tools, just a roll of wax paper from the drawer and a steady hand. Even the rolling pin stayed clean, and once the pie was in the oven, you tossed the paper with no fuss. It was neat, clever, and all about working smarter. Tricks like this helped make dessert feel possible even on the busiest, tightest days, and that meant everything. Pimiento cheese celery boats offered a bright and crunchy appetizer that required almost no effort, yet brought cheerful color to any mid-century table. Housewives mixed shredded sharp cheddar cheese with diced pimientos and mayonnaise until a smooth spread formed, adjusting the seasoning with a pinch of salt and a dash of mild paprika. Sturdy celery ribs were cut into neat lengths and filled with the mixture, creating a crisp base that contrasted with the creamy filling. The red flecks of pimiento against the pale cheese and green celery made each piece look like a small celebration, ideal for bridge club gatherings or last-minute company. Because every ingredient could be stored in the refrigerator or pantry, this dish became a reliable standby for evenings when unexpected guests arrived. Children enjoyed the crunch and mild flavor while adults appreciated the nostalgic taste that reminded them of Southern luncheons. This quick recipe captured the 1950s fascination with colorful presentation and easy preparation, turning a handful of ordinary ingredients into something party-ready in minutes without heating the oven. Soaking wilted lettuce in cold vinegar water was a trick passed down like a whispered kitchen secret. When lettuce started to droop or go soft, it did not get tossed. It got revived. Housewives would fill a bowl with cold water, add a splash of white vinegar, and let the greens soak for 10 to 20 minutes. It crisped them right back up. No waste, no disappointment. This simple trick saved countless salads from being sad or soggy. Before pre-washed greens in bags, lettuce came fresh from the store or garden, and it started wilting fast if not used quickly. But smart homemakers had ways around that. It also helped clean the leaves better than water alone, which was especially important back then. Lettuce was expensive enough without throwing it out before it hit the plate. The result? A crisp, refreshing base for salads that looked and tasted brand new. It may not seem like much today, but in the 1950s, this trick was gold. It kept family meals fresh, appetites satisfied, and budgets intact, all from a little bowl of water and vinegar. No one bragged about it. They just did it, and it worked. Evaporated milk whipped cream was the sort of dessert trick passed between neighbors, not down through cookbooks. When cream was too expensive or just plain missing from the fridge, you reached for that dented can of evaporated milk in the back of the cupboard. You chilled it until it was ice cold, sometimes freezing it for 10 minutes, and then beat it with a whisk or mixer until it fluffed up. If you added a little sugar and a drop of vanilla, you almost could not tell the difference. It would not hold shape as long as the real thing, but it made a bowl of canned peaches or gelatin salad feel like a special treat. Children did not care if it came from a cow or a can. If it looked creamy, that was enough. You could even fold it into puddings or layer it in trifles. The trick was to keep everything cold and to know when to stop mixing. Today's cookbooks skip this entirely. They assume everyone has heavy cream or will just buy whipped topping. But the old way worked just fine, and it felt like magic every time it turned out right. One of the best examples I have of beans being the phenomena they were is 3-bean baked beans. Yes, this was a dish that consisted entirely of different kinds of beans, and it is actually so much better than you're thinking. This variation was kind of like a bean casserole, and it was made using 3 different kinds of typical southern beans. You would have your pinto or navy beans, and then for protein, texture, and firmness, you would add kidney beans. Then, butter beans and/or lima beans would work for flavor and as a topping, and you were pretty much ready to go. Once you had layered your dish, all you had to do was bake it. This was one of the best ways to get a lot of protein into your diet while keeping everyone full. It was one of the most nostalgic dishes that the working class of that generation ever had, and it was something that loads of people grew up with, myself included. There was nothing like coming home to the scent of grandma making fresh baked beans and leaving no stone unturned in terms of effort and preparation. Plus, it would usually go extremely well with barbecue and steaks. Oxtail stew is a true comfort food, perfect for anyone who loves deep, meaty flavors with a luxuriously silky texture. Despite the name, oxtail simply refers to the tail of cattle, rich with collagen and connective tissue, making it perfect for slow-cooked dishes. As it simmers, oxtail transforms, becoming incredibly tender and melt in your mouth, with a broth so thick it's almost like gravy. Loaded up with carrots, potatoes, onions, and warming spices, oxtail stew feels both fancy and wonderfully homey. Enjoyed for centuries around the world, from Jamaican and Caribbean versions to European classics, oxtail has a humble yet flavorful history. And here's a fun fact. In medieval times, oxtail was considered a lesser cut, eaten mostly by peasants. Today, though, it's a delicacy with prices to match. The key to perfect oxtail stew? Patience. This is no quick meal. Slow cooking it for several hours brings out its full, rich flavor while letting the bones add even more depth to the broth. For an extra layer of flavor, try adding a splash of red wine or a dash of soy sauce. Serve with rice, mashed potatoes, or even dumplings to soak up every last drop of the hearty sauce. For a dish that's both rustic and refined, oxtail stew is a timeless favorite just waiting to be rediscovered in your kitchen. This is a very classic dish that was often prepared by grandma in winter. Do not be put off by the word rabbit. It's a tender, lean meat with a mild flavor that's often compared to chicken, but with a bit more character. When you hear the word umami, you naturally think of everything savory and typically found in main courses. Very few people realize that anything with cocoa, in this instance chocolate, also has that flavor. So what is the best way to bring it out of your chocolate? Adding some soy sauce into it can really intensify it because of the saltiness from the sauce. Try this out the next time you bake a cake, truffles, or even cookies and brownies. We know they do not seem like they would go together, but very few things look like a perfect pair until you put the combo into practice. And this is a tried and true one after all. Country Captain Chicken, on the other hand, has some roots that go right back to the spice trade between India and America during the 18th and 19th centuries. It was apparently a British recipe that was made using Indian inspirations, and the term country captain was pretty much used by sailors back then to refer to Indians who were landholders. It was extremely common in Georgia and South Carolina, and it was one of the very first examples we have of real fusion food. Country Captain Chicken itself is a curry stew that has boned chicken, lots of bell peppers, an extreme amount of garlic, and just a touch of curry powder here and there. Then, you put in some raisins and dried fruits for some additional firmness and sweetness, and you're pretty much good to go. In the South, this was a massively celebrated dish. It even had fans up in the White House, as reportedly, Franklin Roosevelt and George Patton were apparently big fans of the dish. It's one of the earliest examples of American cuisine that has a midway point between American, British, and Indian influences. And it didn't take a long time for this dish to spread outside of the South, too. If you really want to go the retro route, then you can't go without exploring all the gelatin madness that took over the 50s. It was a big trend, too, especially with your salads. Oh, and by the way, I'm talking about rabbit stew. The meat of rabbit is rich in proteins and comparatively has less fat content than most meats. Now, this stew defines comfort and health altogether. The basic ingredients for rabbit stew are root vegetables such as carrots, potatoes, onions, and mushrooms cooked in a meaty gravy. This dish has deep roots in European cooking, especially in France and Italy, where rabbits were a backyard staple. Fun fact, Rabbit meat is probably one of the world's most eco-friendly sources of meat since it needs fewer resources for production than other meats such as beef. To get the best out of your rabbit stew, cook it low and slow, letting the meat fall off the bone and infuse the broth with a rich, gamey flavor. If you're feeling adventurous, pour a few spoonfuls of red wine into the pot, or spice it up with a few twirls of thyme and rosemary. Accompany it with a crusty loaf of bread for the bread-dipping accompaniment, and you've got yourself a stew that's comforting, tangy, and a tad exotic, a real winter favorite that needs a revival. Beet green stir-fry was a shining example of how the 1930s turned scraps into sustenance. When you bought or harvested beets, the leafy tops were never discarded, they were cooked. In fact, they were often more valuable than the beet itself. Families would wash them carefully, chop them up, and sauté them in bacon grease, lard, or whatever fat they had. Add a sprinkle of salt or a bit of vinegar, and you had a side dish that tasted far better than its humble roots. The greens were full of nutrients and gave meals color and texture. In cities and rural homes alike, people grew beets in small plots, and nothing was allowed to go to waste. These greens cooked quickly, wilted down, and took on the flavor of whatever you cooked them in. Served alongside potatoes, beans, or cornbread, they added just enough brightness to break up the monotony. It was not fancy, it was smart. Beet greens helped families stretch their gardens, their groceries, and their budgets. You might not miss them now, but back then, they made the difference between a plate that looked full and one that looked empty. Vinegar in meringue stabilizer might not be the most glamorous kitchen tip, but it saved more pies than you can count. Mid-century bakers hated one thing above all else: weepy meringue. That sad little puddle that formed between the lemon filling and the fluffy white top was the enemy. So what did they do? They turned to vinegar. Just a teaspoon, mixed into the whipped egg whites, helped hold the structure, giving the meringue more strength and preventing collapse. It tightened the proteins, firmed up the peaks, and made for a glossier, more dependable finish. You would find this note in the tiny print of pie recipes, usually accompanied by tips like bake at low temp or spread meringue all the way to crust. It was a behind-the-scenes trick, never advertised but always appreciated. Home bakers might not have understood the science, but they knew it worked. And in an era when homemade pies were still a point of pride, a clean slice was everything. Sometimes the best tricks were the quiet ones, the ones that just made you look like you knew exactly what you were doing. Quick oatmeal. Drop cookies gave families a warm, homemade treat without the long wait or complicated steps of traditional baking. Rolled oats were stirred with brown sugar, softened shortening, and a splash of milk until a sticky dough formed that could be dropped by spoonfuls onto a baking sheet. Because the cookies baked in just a few minutes, the kitchen quickly filled with the comforting aroma of toasted oats and caramelized sugar. Housewives relied on this recipe when children returned from school hungry, or when unexpected guests arrived and a sweet bite was needed fast. The chewy texture and simple flavor appealed to everyone, and the recipe was easy enough that older children could help with mixing and scooping. Served with a glass of cold milk, these cookies brought an old-fashioned warmth to even the busiest day. Their speed and reliability made them a beloved staple in countless mid-century households where homemade goodness was always within reach. Homemade cracker crumbs for coating meat were the breadcrumb before breadcrumbs. If a housewife ran out of store-bought crumbs or never bought them in the first place, she reached for a sleeve of saltines. Crushed finely with a rolling pin or the bottom of a glass, the crackers became a crispy coating for chicken cutlets, pork chops, or even fried tomatoes. They stuck well, browned beautifully, and brought a savory crunch to whatever hit the skillet. You could season the crumbs or leave them plain, depending on the dish. Saltines were cheap, shelf-stable, and always on hand, which made them perfect for coating duty. Housewives made it look easy, and it was. It also meant no waste, since stale crackers were even better for the job. These crumbs were humble, but they worked hard. And in a time where every part of the pantry had a purpose, they earned their place at the table. Old coffee reboil with eggshells was a second chance in a cup, When fresh coffee grounds were scarce or when no one could afford to waste them, you would reuse the old grounds with a little twist. You cracked an eggshell into the pot before boiling. The shell helped settle the grit and bitterness, giving the brew a smoother, clearer taste. Sometimes you added a splash of cold water at the end to help the grounds sink even further. The result was not gourmet, but it was strong, hot, and clean. It got you through another morning. People called it cowboy coffee or camp coffee, but it was just what folks did when the tin of beans was running low. It taught you how to make something better with what little you had left. You will not find this on a fancy cafe menu. But for a long time, it was how real people started their day. Dry mustard rubs were more than just a way to flavor meat. They were a quiet method of preservation long before refrigerators took over. A generous dusting of dry mustard, often mixed with salt, pepper, and a few pantry spices, was rubbed deep into cuts of pork, beef, or even game. The mix helped dry the surface, seal in juices, and gave the meat a subtle bite that came alive once cooked. These rubs worked especially well when meat had to be kept cool in a cellar or icebox and used over several days. For families who could not afford to let anything spoil, it was a little layer of safety and a whole lot of flavor. As the meat rested, the mustard acted like a protective barrier, especially in roasts or loins. When you finally cooked it, that seasoning had sunk in all the way through. Some even used mustard rubs before curing or smoking. These days, we rarely think about spices as preservers. We expect refrigeration to do the work. But back then, a tin of mustard powder was one of the most useful things in the pantry. Bacon grease as a biscuit fat substitute was not just clever, it was common sense. When butter was too pricey or scarce and shortening was rationed, folks used what was already in the pan. Bacon grease, saved in a can or jar near the stove, became the go-to for biscuits, cornbread, and frying. It added depth, richness, and just a hint of smoke. Strained to remove bits, chilled until firm, it worked like lard and made everything taste better. You saw it in Southern cookbooks, recipe cards, and wartime pamphlets. For many, it was just the way things were done, and if someone threw it out, they probably did not grow up cooking. It was humble, it was honest, and it made unforgettable biscuits. Bread-soaked meatballs were a small act of genius hiding in plain sight. When you did not have enough breadcrumbs, or when the bread itself was too stale to eat, you soaked it in milk until it turned soft and fluffy. Then you mixed it into ground meat, herbs, and maybe an egg if you had one. The result? A tender, juicy meatball that held its shape without drying out. This trick also stretched your meat further, letting 1 pound do the work of 2. It came from Italian kitchens, but American homes embraced it fast. Sunday dinners, church potlucks, and penny-pinching mothers all used it. And it was not just for meatballs. You would see the same method in meatloaf and stuffed peppers, too. The soaked bread kept things moist without adding weight. Modern recipes may call for panko or fancy crumbs, but this old trick still beats them all when it comes to comfort and thrift. Canned fruit syrup as sweetener was the secret sauce behind dozens of desserts and drinks when sugar was rationed or expensive. The syrup from canned peaches, pears, or pineapples was thick, sweet, and already full of fruit flavor, so thrifty cooks learned to never throw it away. They poured it into cake batters to replace sugar and milk, used it to thin frosting or sweeten gelatin molds, and even stirred it into coffee or tea. Some recipes called for reducing it slightly on the stovetop to make a more concentrated syrup. Others added cornstarch and used it as a glaze for pound cake or donuts. It was a way to get extra flavor and moisture without using up precious pantry staples. Magazines from the 1940s through the 1970s suggested it often, usually alongside tips for reusing the fruit itself in upside-down cakes or salad toppings. It was a full-circle solution. Nothing wasted, everything sweetened. If you grew up with canned fruit, you probably remember the taste of that syrup more than the peaches themselves. Gravy powder from pan scrapings was the kind of invention that came from hunger and a good sense of timing. After roasting or frying, the browned bits at the bottom of the pan were never wasted. They were scraped, dried slowly in the oven or near the stove, and then ground into a coarse powder that could last for weeks. A spoonful stirred into hot water gave you instant gravy, no bouillon cubes, no jars, no packets. It tasted real because it was. That powder held the memory of every meal it came from: roast chicken, seared chops, bacon ends. Some cooks even mixed it with flour and lard to make little gravy starter balls, ready to go at a moment's notice. The flavor was deep, smoky, and hard to pin down because it came from life, not a label. Today, we throw those scrapings away. We clean pans too quickly. But back then, this was the best part. It turned yesterday's effort into tomorrow's comfort. Mashed peas as sandwich spread was one of those strange little inventions that stuck around longer than anyone expected. When meat was scarce and deli slices were a luxury, people turned to vegetables for sandwich fillings. Peas, cooked, mashed, and mixed with mayonnaise or mustard, became a go-to choice. The texture was creamy, the flavor mild and earthy, and the color a cheerful green that stood out on soft white bread. You might find it alongside shredded lettuce, thinly sliced pickles, or even a hard-boiled egg. Sometimes people added a pinch of salt or a splash of vinegar to punch it up. It was not about loving peas, it was about having something hearty to spread between two slices. This trick showed up in wartime and Depression-era lunchbox guides, often marketed as a nutritious, affordable alternative to ham or tuna salad. And oddly enough, for a generation raised on making do, it became a taste they remembered fondly. It was cheap, it was strange, and it worked. Cold water shrinking for pie shells is one of those clever tricks almost lost to time. When you blind bake a pie crust, baking it without filling, it tends to puff or slump. Today, people use weights or beans to hold it in place. But back then, you would drop the shell briefly into a bowl of cold water just before baking. The sudden chill made the dough contract, hugging the pan tighter and holding its shape. It was a small act with a big result. No gadgets, no guesswork, just a bowl of cold water, a steady hand, and a bit of faith. This method worked especially well for custard pies or fruit pies that needed a crisp bottom. It also prevented bubbling and cracking, something even experienced bakers still fight with. You would not find this tip in many modern cookbooks. It was more likely to be passed from grandmother to granddaughter with a wink. Sometimes the simplest answers are the ones we forget first. Hardtack with gravy was a way of reviving something almost too tough to chew into something soft and sustaining. Hardtack, that old sailor's biscuit made of just flour and water, was shelf-stable and cheap. You could find it in army rations and emergency pantries, and in the Great Depression, people brought it back out of necessity. By itself, it was like biting into a brick. But soak it in milk or water, then smother it in gravy or fat, and suddenly you had something warm and edible. The gravy could be made from bacon drippings, flour, and whatever seasonings you had on hand. Sometimes people would stir in bits of onion or mashed beans to bulk it out. The result was soft, salty, and just enough like dinner to satisfy. Kids might not have loved it, but they learned to eat it fast. It filled you up and made good use of food that was meant to last forever. In hard times, that mattered. Hardtack with gravy was a lesson in patience, in chewing, and in making do with what you had, even if what you had was practically stone. Hot dog and relish skillet hash gave busy homemakers a hearty meal that could be prepared with nothing more than a single pan and a few simple ingredients already waiting in the refrigerator. Diced hot dogs were browned alongside small cubes of potato until the edges turned crisp and golden, releasing a savory aroma that quickly filled the kitchen. A spoonful of sweet pickle relish stirred in at the end added a tangy contrast and a burst of color that made the dish as cheerful as it was satisfying. Many families enjoyed this as a quick dinner after a long day because it required no special cuts of meat and stretched a modest grocery budget. Children loved the familiar flavor of hot dogs, while parents appreciated the ease of cleanup and the comforting combination of salty and sweet. The recipe fit perfectly into the fast-paced 1950s lifestyle, proving that a warm and filling supper did not need hours of preparation. In less than 10 minutes, it turned humble ingredients into a dish worthy of a place at any family table. Skillet roasting coffee beans at home was an act of love and patience. Before electric roasters and fancy blends, families would buy green coffee beans in bulk and roast them right in their kitchens. A heavy cast iron skillet was all you needed. You kept the beans moving constantly to prevent burning, usually shaking the pan or stirring with a long spoon over medium heat. The smell was smoky, earthy, and almost intoxicating. You had to listen closely for the first crack, that sharp popping sound that told you the roast was beginning. Some people liked a lighter roast, others waited for a darker color and fuller aroma. Once cooled, sometimes wrapped in a damp towel, they were ground by hand or in a manual grinder and brewed fresh. It was a whole process, but it made your morning cup feel earned. Today's coffee comes pre-roasted, pre-ground, and sealed in plastic. But back then, roasting your own beans was a skill that saved money, deepened flavor, and filled the house with the kind of smell that told you the day was starting right. Rice-stuffed baked apples were one of those meals that towed the line between dinner and dessert. Apples stored well through winter, and rice was cheap, filling, and easy to cook. Together, they made something practical and gently sweet. You hollowed an apple, stuffed it with cooked rice, and baked it until it softened and started to collapse. If you had cinnamon or brown sugar, great. If not, a pat of lard did the trick. Some added milk to make it creamier. It was not fancy or meant to impress, but it filled stomachs and made children smile. In a time where smiles were hard to come by, that counted. These apples were often served after a bowl of soup or beans as a way to end on something soft. They warmed the kitchen and reminded folks that even hard times had gentle endings. Peanut butter and meatloaf might sound like a dare, but in the mid-century kitchen, it was just another thrifty trick. Ground beef was expensive, especially when you were trying to feed more mouths than you had meat. So home cooks started mixing in all sorts of things to bulk it up: breadcrumbs, oats, mashed beans, and yes, peanut butter. A few spoonfuls of peanut butter made the mixture stickier and easier to mold, added a little fat for moisture, and brought a nutty depth that some people genuinely came to love. The flavor was subtle, not overpowering, and often paired with ketchup or tomato sauce on top to balance it out. You would find this idea popping up in wartime rationing cookbooks and community recipe swaps, usually in the margins with little notes like "kids did not notice" or "husband approved." It was especially popular in places where peanuts were cheap and beef was not. These meatloaves were humble, hearty, and surprisingly flavorful, and when baked right, they held together beautifully. The next time you are low on ingredients and high on curiosity, try it. You might understand why people kept doing it even after the war ended. Shrimp cocktail cups offered a dash of coastal elegance that could be assembled in moments using pantry and freezer staples. Canned shrimp or thawed frozen shrimp were quickly tossed in a tangy sauce of ketchup, prepared horseradish, and a squeeze of lemon juice. The mixture was spooned into small paper baking cups or tiny glass dishes and chilled briefly before serving. Guests enjoyed the bright, briny flavor and the neat individual portions that made parties feel more sophisticated without adding to the hostess's workload. Housewives appreciated how this dish turned inexpensive canned seafood into something festive and memorable with almost no effort. The cool, refreshing bite made it a popular choice for summer gatherings and cocktail hours when heavy dishes felt out of place. This quick appetizer reflected the 1950s enthusiasm for modern entertaining and the growing availability of seafood in everyday markets, proving that elegance could be achieved on a tight schedule and a modest budget. Flour and salt meat stretchers were not about taste. They were about survival and smart thinking. When a pound of meat had to feed 6 or 7 people, there was no room for waste. Home cooks would mix the meat with a cup or two of flour, sometimes seasoned with pepper or dried herbs, and add a heavy pinch of salt. That mixture got turned into patties, crumbles, or meatballs. The flour made it stick together, and the salt helped pull out the flavor from the scraps of beef or pork. Sometimes an egg was added, sometimes not. Fried in a pan or baked in a loaf tin, it held its shape and filled the plate. Kids did not ask what was in it. They were just glad to have a warm dinner with something meaty at the center. These stretchers kept food on the table long after the groceries had run out. You will not find this trick in today's glossy cookbooks. Nobody wants to admit that flour can make meat go twice as far, but ask anyone who lived through the hard years, and they will tell you it was a trick worth knowing. Using dish towels to proof bread was a trick rooted in simplicity and trust. Before plastic wrap and modern proofing boxes, 1950s housewives would set their bread dough in a bowl, cover it with a clean kitchen towel, and find the warmest corner of the kitchen. The towel kept the dough safe from drafts, dust, and drying out. It also breathed, allowing the yeast to rise properly without trapping too much moisture. You could fold it gently over the bowl and check back an hour later to see the magic happen. Proofing bread was never about high-tech tools. It was about warmth, patience, and rhythm. The dish towel was part of that ritual. Every good baking day began with the smell of yeast and a soft cotton cloth ready to cover the future loaf. Housewives had a feel for timing that no machine could match. They watched dough rise like it was an old friend returning home. And the towel was more than fabric. It was a part of the process, passed down through habit and handed across generations. Crumbled biscuit breakfast bowls were a warm and simple way to start a cold morning when you had almost nothing left. The trick was to take yesterday's biscuits, already hard or going stale, break them into pieces and pour over hot milk. Add a pinch of sugar, maybe a bit of cinnamon or molasses, and let the mixture soak until the biscuit softened. What you got was something between a porridge and a bread pudding. It was not fancy, but it was filling, warm, and easy on the stomach. In the 1930s, breakfast was often made from leftovers, and this one was a favorite among both children and adults. The milk made it feel rich. The sugar gave it a sweet lift. And the biscuit? That was just doing its job one more time before being truly done. It was a gentle way to begin the day, especially when the day ahead promised to be anything but gentle. This bowl of sweet, soggy comfort was more than a meal. It was a quiet promise that even the smallest things could be made useful again. Milk toast for sick days was as gentle as food could get. It was the go-to recovery meal when your stomach was queasy, your appetite was gone, or you just needed something soft and warm. The idea was simple. Toast a slice of plain bread, place it in a shallow bowl, and pour over warm milk, sometimes sweetened with a bit of sugar, sometimes sprinkled with cinnamon. The toast softened into something halfway between soup and cereal, easy to eat and even easier to digest. For generations, this was comfort food in its purest form, especially for children, the elderly, and anyone too worn out to chew. You would find it in vintage home nurse guides, cookbooks for invalids, and even school health manuals. It was not flashy, not flavorful, but it came with a kind of tenderness that people remembered long after they recovered. A spoonful of milk toast felt like someone tucking you in. In a world full of rich broths and fancy juices, sometimes all you needed was bread, milk, and a quiet moment to rest. Coffee gelatin cream turned a humble cup of coffee into a chilled dessert that felt surprisingly sophisticated and indulgent. Strongly brewed coffee was sweetened and mixed with plain gelatin, then poured into molds to set until firm. Just before serving, each portion was topped with a generous spoon of lightly whipped cream that softened against the cool surface. The result was a bittersweet treat that appealed to adults who wanted something less sugary than typical puddings, yet still refreshing on warm evenings. Housewives appreciated that it could be prepared hours ahead of time, freeing them to focus on other tasks or enjoy company without last-minute fuss. The dark amber color and delicate wobble gave it an elegant presence on the table despite its simple preparation. Sipped alongside a small cookie or slice of pound cake, it showcased the 1950s taste for modern coffee-flavored desserts and proved that a pantry staple could easily become an impressive finish to a meal. Cabbage leaf meat preservers were the poor man's parchment paper. When you had a small cut of meat and needed it to stay moist, you wrapped it in cabbage leaves. The leaves kept the juices in, added a faint sweetness, and softened up into something you could eat alongside the roast. You could bake it, steam it, or even tuck it into a skillet with a lid. The trick worked with ground meat, too. Stuffed cabbage rolls were just a natural evolution. It was popular among Eastern European immigrants, but caught on fast across rural America. The cabbage acted like a seal, but it was edible, cheap, and always around. People grew cabbage in their gardens and used every bit of it. Today, we use foil or fancy bags to lock in moisture, but back then, a cabbage leaf did the job just fine. Cabbage leaf meat preservers were the poor man's parchment paper. When you had a small cut of meat and needed it to stay moist, you wrapped it in cabbage leaves. The leaves kept the juices in, added a faint sweetness, and softened up into something you could eat alongside the roast. You could bake it, steam it, or even tuck it into a skillet with a lid. The trick worked with ground meat, too. Stuffed cabbage rolls were just a natural evolution. It was popular among Eastern European immigrants, but caught on fast across rural America. The cabbage acted like a seal, but it was edible, cheap, and always around. People grew cabbage in their gardens and used every bit of it. Today, we use foil or fancy bags to lock in moisture, but back then, a cabbage leaf did the job just fine. Sour milk biscuits were what happened when nothing could go to waste, not even spoiled milk. In the 1930s, refrigeration was rare and expensive, so milk often turned sour before it could all be used. But instead of tossing it, home cooks put it to work. The acid in the sour milk reacted with baking soda, creating lift and softness in biscuit dough. No need for eggs, no need for fresh buttermilk. You just mixed flour, fat, soda, and that slightly sour milk into a sticky dough and dropped it onto a hot baking sheet. The result was a light, tender biscuit with a subtle tang. Some families added herbs or sugar, depending on what they had. Others used bacon grease instead of butter or skipped salt altogether. These biscuits were eaten with molasses, honey, gravy, or just plain. They were fast, filling, and above all, forgiving. If the milk was on the edge of turning but not gone completely, it was a perfect fit. Sour milk biscuits were one of those practical tricks passed from mother to daughter, a quiet way of making sure nothing got thrown out before it gave all it had. Shredded carrot in gelatin salads was a strange but oddly elegant touch that showed up all over mid-century kitchens. Back when gelatin was not just dessert, but a full-blown meal format, people liked to add texture and color to their wobbly molds. Enter the humble carrot, shredded fine and stirred into orange or lemon gelatin for a bright, crunchy twist. The sweetness of the gelatin and the mild earthiness of the carrot balanced surprisingly well, and the end result was a chilled salad that looked like sunshine on a plate. You would find it served at potlucks, funerals, church luncheons, and any meal where presentation mattered more than explanation. Sometimes folks added pineapple or raisins too, giving it a sweet-sour profile that people either loved or politely ignored. Still, the shredded carrot stuck around because it was easy, inexpensive, and made the mold feel a little more like food and less like decoration. It is one of those dishes people remember from their grandmother's house, even if they never quite liked it. But in its own weird way, it was beautiful. Celery cream soup. Shortcut gave homemakers a comforting bowl of soup with almost no effort, turning pantry staples into a warm meal suitable for lunch or a light supper. A can of condensed cream of celery soup was combined with an equal measure of milk and whisked over gentle heat until smooth and steaming. A small knob of butter and a dash of white pepper added richness without extending the cooking time. Housewives often served the soup with crackers or a slice of toasted bread, creating a balanced dish that felt nurturing on chilly evenings. Because it relied on ingredients that were easy to keep on hand, it became a dependable choice when groceries were low or unexpected guests appeared. The soft green hue and delicate aroma brought a hint of freshness to the table, even in winter months when produce was scarce. In just a few minutes, a humble can and a splash of milk transformed into a meal that soothed families and showcased the quiet ingenuity of the mid-century kitchen. Boiling bones for soup broth was an act of transformation, taking scraps and turning them into something nourishing and deeply flavorful. A leftover chicken carcass, beef knuckles, pork ribs, nothing went to waste. Housewives would toss the bones into a pot with onion ends, carrot tops, and peppercorns, then let it simmer low and slow. Hours later, they had a rich stock ready to be the base for a dozen different meals. No cartons, no cubes, just the honest flavor of what was left behind. It made soups heartier, gravies deeper, and even plain rice a little more special. Bones were not trash. They were the beginning of something. Housewives understood that a good broth meant tomorrow's dinner was halfway done. This was not just thrift, it was skill. Broth making was a quiet background job in the rhythm of home life. You did it while the laundry dried or while you wiped the table. It filled the house with comfort before anyone took a bite. Potato boil water for gravy base is one of those tricks that feels too simple to matter until you taste it. When you boil potatoes, the water turns cloudy and thick with starch. Most people pour it down the drain, but the old cooks saved it. That cloudy water was liquid gold, perfect for thickening gravies, stews, or even making a quick roux without needing butter or flour. It added body and just a hint of potato flavor, which paired beautifully with meat scraps or leftover vegetables. It was warm, filling, and somehow made everything else taste richer. You could stir in pan drippings or a spoonful of mustard or vinegar and have something that passed for a real sauce. Nothing fancy, but deeply satisfying. This trick barely shows up in cookbooks today, even though it worked better than some of the thickeners you find on store shelves. It was a quiet skill, one you learned by watching, not by reading. And once you knew it, you never threw out potato water again. Grated raw potato pancakes were born out of pure necessity and just a little bit of grease. All you needed was a couple of raw potatoes, some flour to bind, an onion if you had it, and a hot skillet. Shred it all fine, press out the water, mix it together, and fry until golden. What came out was crispy at the edges, soft in the middle, and filling enough to count as breakfast, lunch, or dinner. These pancakes did not pretend to be fancy. They just showed up and got the job done. Potatoes were the backbone of many meals in the 1930s because they were cheap, lasted forever in storage, and grew in poor soil. You could trade for them, grow them, and feed a family for days with just a sack. These cakes were sometimes topped with applesauce or served alongside beans or eaten plain and hot off the pan. They were adaptable, frugal, and satisfying. A hot cake in a cold kitchen was enough to lift your spirits a bit. That crunch meant you were doing okay, at least for today. Boiled hamburger patties were never glamorous, but they got the job done. In the name of health, or sometimes just thrift, home cooks were advised to boil their ground beef patties instead of frying them. The idea was to reduce fat and keep the meat moist without needing extra oil. The patties were formed, dropped into gently simmering water or broth, and cooked until firm. The result was softer than a grilled burger, but still surprisingly flavorful, especially if the liquid was seasoned. Some added onions or garlic to the pot to give the meat extra depth, while others used leftover broth for soups later. This method showed up in diet cookbooks, military manuals, and penny-saving guides alike. It was also recommended for feeding young children or the elderly who needed soft, easy-to-chew proteins. It might not have had that backyard burger smell, but it filled a plate just the same. And sometimes, especially during hard times, that was all that mattered. Gelatin mold leftover savor might sound like a punishment today, but back then it was a point of pride. Once gelatin became affordable and easy to prepare, people found all kinds of ways to use it, especially as a vessel to stretch meals and make use of leftovers. You had a little ham, some canned peas, a scoop of last night's macaroni salad. Mix it all into lemon or tomato gelatin and pour it into a mold. Chill, unmold, and suddenly you had a centerpiece. It was cold. It was colorful. It was the future, or so they said. These savory gelatin molds were featured everywhere from homemaker magazines to government-sponsored nutrition guides. They promised frugality, beauty, and innovation all in one jiggly dish. Housewives with limited means could make a full meal look polished and party-ready. People even had specific. Onion skin dye for pickled eggs was one of those beautiful accidents that turned necessity into tradition. When eggs were hard to come by and pickling became a way to preserve what little you had, people looked for natural ways to add color and depth to the brine. Boiling onion skins, red or yellow, released pigments that stained the eggshells and even tinted the whites with subtle amber or rose tones. It was a quiet, rustic kind of beauty. No artificial dyes, no fancy techniques. Just leftover peels that most folks would have tossed. The flavor stayed the same, vinegary, firm, and savory, but the look was something else entirely. These eggs were packed into jars, gifted during holidays, or brought out when guests came over, turning frugal food into something you could be proud of. The trick is almost forgotten now, replaced by food coloring or store-bought brines. But for those who remember, it was always a little bit of magic pulled from the scraps. Using scissors to cut herbs and bacon was one of those simple tricks that just made sense. Before food processors and fancy slicers, housewives relied on kitchen shears for the small stuff. A quick snip of chives over a salad, a rough cut of parsley into a soup, or even slicing bacon into strips before it hit the pan. It was all faster with scissors. You did it right over the dish, with no cutting board to clean. Less mess, more control. It felt precise and easy, especially when time was tight. The same shears used to open packages or trim butcher paper were rinsed and put right to work. They were sturdy, reliable, and always within reach. This trick was not flashy, but it saved minutes when minutes mattered. Even kids could learn to use them safely under watchful eyes. And while modern kitchens come with gadgets for everything, sometimes all you need is a good pair of scissors and a steady hand. Cast iron lid baking was born out of necessity and kept alive by sheer determination. When families had no access to an oven, or when it was too hot to fire one up, they made do with what they had. And what they had was a heavy cast iron pot, usually with a domed lid. Flip that lid over, set it on a flame, and you had a perfectly usable griddle surface for baking bannock, soda bread, or flat cakes. Some folks even propped up the lid with bricks and piled coals on top to create an improvised oven. It took practice to keep the heat even, but the reward was hot bread on a day you thought there would be none. This method showed up in everything from log cabins to war kitchens, and it never let people down. Cast iron held heat like nothing else, and when times got tough, it doubled as bakeware, skillet, and roasting pan. The lid was more than a cover, it was a secret weapon. These tricks rarely appear in modern books, but they kept people fed for generations. Cabbage water broth might not sound like much, but in the 1930s it was enough to keep people going. Boiling cabbage was already a regular routine, but families quickly learned to never pour the water down the drain. That cloudy, sulfur-scented liquid held nutrients, starch, and just enough flavor to turn into a soup base. Some would throw in a diced potato, a handful of onion skins, or a bit of old bread to thicken it. Others might add salt, if they had any, and call it a night. There was a kind of pride in making something from what others saw as nothing. It might not have tasted like much, but it was hot, filling, and warm on cold days when spirits were thin. In some houses, that broth became the start of a stew that would stretch out over days. You reused everything back then, especially the things no one thought to save. Even the cabbage leaves, once cooked soft and pale, might be mashed and eaten with a splash of vinegar. But the broth was the heart of it. It told a story of making do with what you had, even if it was only boiled water and scraps. It was soup born of hardship and resilience. Split biscuit griddle reheat was how you made yesterday's biscuits feel like today's blessing. You took cold, slightly stale biscuits from the day before, split them open, and fried the cut sides in bacon grease or lard. The crust got crispy, the inside stayed soft, and what was once boring became suddenly hard to resist. It was quick, easy, and made the whole kitchen smell like breakfast, even if it was just leftovers. You did not need to add anything, but sometimes a dab of jam or honey made it extra special. Some folks even layered a slice of ham or fried egg between the halves for a quick sandwich, especially when mornings were rushed and food was scarce. In households where waste was not an option, this trick kept bread from the trash and put something warm on the plate. It also stretched a single batch of biscuits across more meals, more bellies, and more days. No recipe needed, just memory and muscle. Today, you will not find this move in a cooking app, but for the cooks who lived through lean times, it was just how things were done. Oatmeal meat extender was one of the smartest tricks to come out of wartime cooking, and one of the least noticed. The idea was simple. Take a little meat and make it go further by adding rolled oats. Mixed with ground beef, eggs, and seasonings, the oats absorbed flavor, held moisture, and blended in so well that most people did not even notice. They made the meat stretch without sacrificing texture, and they were cheap, filling, and always on hand. This trick became especially common in meatloaf, burgers, and even meatballs, anywhere a little extra bulk was needed. Cookbooks from the 1930s and 1940s praised it as a nutritious alternative or thrift-friendly filler. Some families used it so often that it just became the default. You might even say the oats carried the meal without getting credit. That is what made it brilliant. It was not flashy, but it worked. And when you were feeding 6 people on a 2-pound package of meat, that quiet brilliance made all the difference. Crustless onion pie was a depression dish that found a way to taste rich without spending a dime on extras. The crust was left out to save on flour and fat, and instead, the filling became the star. Chopped onions were sautéed in grease, layered into a pan, and covered with a mixture of eggs, flour, and water or milk, whatever was available. Sometimes a bit of cheese or herbs made it in, but most of the time it was just plain, seasoned with salt and pepper. It baked into something soft, savory, and incredibly satisfying. The onions caramelized slightly, giving the dish a natural sweetness that balanced the richness of the eggs. It was served sliced like a pie, though it felt more like a casserole or a crustless quiche. Perfect for dinner or even breakfast, and always appreciated for how cheap and clever it was. It could feed many with little and gave a sense of fullness that lasted. Crustless onion pie was proof that frugal did not have to mean flavorless. Skillet roasting coffee beans at home was an act of love and patience. Before electric roasters and fancy blends, families would buy green coffee beans in bulk and roast them right in their kitchens. A heavy cast iron skillet was all you needed. You kept the beans moving constantly to prevent burning, usually shaking the pan or stirring with a long spoon over medium heat. The smell was smoky, earthy, and almost intoxicating. You had to listen closely for the first crack, that sharp popping sound that told you the roast was beginning. Some people liked a lighter roast, others waited for a darker color and fuller aroma. Once cooled, sometimes wrapped in a damp towel, they were ground by hand or in a manual grinder and brewed fresh. It was a whole process, but it made your morning cup feel earned. Today's coffee comes pre-roasted, pre-ground, and sealed in plastic. But back then, roasting your own beans was a skill that saved money, deepened flavor, and filled the house with the kind of smell that told you the day was starting right. Using coffee grounds to deodorize the fridge was one of those tricks that seemed odd until it worked. Back before baking soda became the default fix, housewives would scoop yesterday's grounds into a bowl and place it quietly on a refrigerator shelf. The grounds soaked up odor without adding any strange smell of their own. It was quiet, reliable, and made use of something already on hand. Housewives loved finding second lives for everyday items, and this one was a winner. If your fridge started to smell like onions or last Sunday's roast, the grounds pulled the stink right out. And they did it naturally. No chemicals, no fuss. Plus, it made opening the door a little more pleasant, especially with company around. You might not think about it today, but back then, no one wanted their butter tasting like cabbage. This little trick helped keep flavors clean, meals fresh, and dignity intact. It was one more example of turning waste into usefulness and making the kitchen work smarter, not harder. And when you are running a household on a shoestring, that kind of wisdom matters more than anything. Cold water shrinking for pie shells is one of those clever tricks almost lost to time. When you blind bake a pie crust, baking it without filling, it tends to puff or slump. Today, people use weights or beans to hold it in place. But back then, you would drop the shell briefly into a bowl of cold water just before baking. The sudden chill made the dough contract, hugging the pan tighter and holding its shape. It was a small act with a big result. No gadgets, no guesswork, just a bowl of cold water, a steady hand, and a bit of faith. This method worked especially well for custard pies or fruit pies that needed a crisp bottom. It also prevented bubbling and cracking, something even experienced bakers still fight with. You would not find this tip in many modern cookbooks. It was more likely to be passed from grandmother to granddaughter with a wink. Sometimes the simplest answers are the ones we forget first. Coffee can bread baking was born out of pure practicality, but it somehow felt a little magical too. If you had a clean empty can, anywhere from an old coffee tin to a leftover fruit cocktail can, you had yourself a bread pan. These cans were used for everything from banana bread to steamed Boston brown bread, and they gave each loaf that tall, round look you could not get from a standard pan. The inside of the can would be greased with bacon fat or butter, filled partway with dough, and then either baked or steamed depending on the recipe. The end result was a soft, rich bread with a golden crust and a shape that stood proud on the plate. Some cans were even reused again and again, passed down like family heirlooms, with their dents and scratches telling their own story. And when the bread came out, kids always thought it looked a little like cake. So of course it disappeared in minutes. Old cookbooks called these canned loaves or pantry tins, and for good reason. You made do with what you had, and the results were better than expected. Coffee cans made perfect pans, and no one thought twice about it. Plain boiled wheat berries were a dish that reminded people just how far they had come, and how far they still had to go. Wheat berries are whole, unprocessed kernels of wheat that take a long time to cook and an even longer time to chew. But during the Depression, they were affordable, full of fiber, and could be bought in bulk. Families would boil them for hours, softening them just enough to be spooned into bowls like porridge. Sometimes a bit of salt or molasses was added, but most of the time it was just grain and water. The texture was dense, almost nutty, and the feeling of fullness lasted longer than most other meals. It was common on farms and in rural communities where wheat was grown or traded directly. The simplicity of it made it reliable, and when paired with a piece of bread or a spoonful of jam, it could pass as breakfast or dinner. Some families toasted leftover wheat berries to reuse in stews or baked them into loaves. No part of the grain was wasted, and no meal was taken for granted. This was not food for pleasure. It was food for survival. Oven-dried breadcrumb saver was less of a recipe and more of a way of life. Any time you had bread that went stale, and back then, that was often, you dried it out in the oven, crushed it by hand, and stored it for later. Nothing got tossed. These homemade crumbs were used for coating fish, thickening soups, binding meatloaf, and topping baked casseroles. A batch could last weeks if you kept it dry and cool. Some people seasoned them with herbs or garlic powder, while others kept them plain and let the dish carry the flavor. Cookbooks from the 1940s and 1950s listed breadcrumbs as an everyday ingredient, not something you bought at the store. They called them pantry gold and treated them with care. It was a small step toward stretching every meal and making use of everything, and it came with that quiet pride of not letting good food go to waste. These crumbs had a texture you could not get from store-bought. More rustic, more honest. They turned the ordinary into something that felt home-cooked and personal. Corncob broth for soups was one of those recipes that showed how deep American resourcefulness really went. After eating fresh corn, you did not toss the cobs. You simmered them. A big pot of water, a few bare cobs, maybe some onion or pepper if you had it. The cobs still held sweetness and starch, which thickened the broth and gave it a soft, buttery flavor. It became the perfect base for chowders, bean stews, or simple vegetable soups. Some people even froze the used cobs for winter cooking. Nothing was wasted. This trick worked especially well in the South and Midwest, where corn was king. It made your kitchen smell like summer, even in January. These days, most people would never think to keep a cob after the kernels are gone. But for those who remember, it was like getting a second meal for free. Mayonnaise cake moisture hack was a quiet baking miracle that nobody saw coming, until they tasted it. In lean times, when you didn't have fresh eggs, butter, or milk, you reached for a spoonful of mayonnaise. It sounds bizarre today, but back then it was a stroke of culinary genius. Mayonnaise is, after all, just egg yolk, vinegar, and oil. Exactly the building blocks a cake needs to rise and stay moist. When mixed into a chocolate batter, it transformed the crumb into something soft, rich, and almost fudge-like. Even picky eaters didn't know the secret. You could serve it at birthdays, potlucks, or even Sunday suppers, and not a soul would guess what was inside. It worked with lemon cake, spice cake, even banana bread in a pinch. It didn't matter what brand you used, store-bought or homemade, it all added the right kind of richness. Long before vegan substitutions and plant-based baking went mainstream, people used what they had and made it work. Some families kept the recipe secret. Others passed it down proudly. Either way, this strange little trick proved that resourcefulness could taste like celebration and that a spoonful of something unexpected could bring joy to the table. Double-duty broiler drawers were the toaster ovens of their time, except they came built right into the stove. Found just under the oven, the broiler drawer was where housewives melted cheese, crisped breadcrumbs, or gave sandwiches that perfect golden top. It heated fast and got hot, really hot. If you were careful, you could slide in a tray of garlic bread or a casserole and get a bubbly browned finish in minutes. It also doubled as a way to toast bread slices before toasters were standard in every home. This drawer saved time and effort. It was right there, part of the rhythm of cooking. You learned to use it without burning your fingers, and once you did, it became your best-kept secret. Housewives loved its versatility. It did not need extra space on the counter. It did its job well and quietly. These drawers were small, hot, and powerful, just like the women who used them. Sugar syrup canning seals were a sweet solution when real canning tools were hard to find. Before vacuum lids and pressure gauges became common, families often relied on a thick sugar syrup poured directly over fruit in jars. As the syrup cooled, it hardened just enough to create a glossy seal that kept out air, moisture, and insects. This sticky barrier helped preserve both the vibrant color and the shape of whatever was inside: juicy peaches, fresh strawberries, plums, or crisp apple slices. When you opened one of those jars in the dead of winter, the fruit still looked and tasted like summer. It wasn't perfect, but it was clever. The syrup was made with nothing more than boiled sugar and water, sometimes enhanced with a squeeze of lemon juice, a cinnamon stick, or a clove for a whisper of spice. While wax sealing was also common, syrup was simpler and added flavor. It was a preservation method born out of creativity, one that turned humble pantry staples into long-lasting comfort. Today, you won't find this in many modern cookbooks or safety guides, but in hard times, it was one of many tricks that brought color and sweetness to a season that offered neither. Orange juice glazed carrots were the kind of dinner party dish that felt fancier than it was. Carrots were cheap and easy to store, but no one really got excited about them until you added a splash of orange juice and a bit of butter. The acid in the juice softened the carrots just right, while the sugars caramelized slightly, giving everything a glossy finish. It made a plain root vegetable taste bright, warm, and a little unexpected. This trick started appearing in cookbooks in the 1950s and really caught on in the 1960s when citrus became a trendy flavor in savory foods. Some cooks added a dash of honey or cinnamon, while others left it clean and simple. It was easy to make, easy to scale for a crowd, and looked beautiful on the plate. This was the kind of side dish that made people feel like they were eating something a little more refined, even when it cost barely $1 to make. A little citrus went a long way, and carrots never looked back. Baked rice and onion casserole was simple, plain, and deeply dependable. In the hardest years of the 1930s, families needed meals that filled the belly without emptying the pantry, and this one checked every box. You started with raw rice, mixed it with chopped onions and whatever fat you had, bacon grease, lard, even a dab of margarine. Sometimes a splash of milk or broth went in for moisture, but often it was just water and a bit of salt. The whole thing was baked slowly in the oven until the rice swelled, the onions softened, and the top formed a thin, crisp crust. It smelled like comfort and tasted like survival. There was nothing fancy in it, but that was the point. It worked. You could serve it hot for dinner or eat the leftovers cold for breakfast. Some added beans, others stirred in eggs to bulk it up. But even in its bare form, it felt like a full meal. It was the kind of dish that disappeared fast because it was familiar, filling, and just warm enough to carry you through. Malted chocolate egg cream brought the magic of a soda fountain into the home kitchen with a drink that felt indulgent, yet needed only minutes to prepare. Chocolate syrup and malted milk powder were whisked with a splash of cold milk until smooth, then topped with a vigorous pour of chilled seltzer that created a frothy head. Despite the name, no egg was used, just the airy foam that gave it a playful charm. Children marveled at the bubbles while adults enjoyed a nostalgic taste of their own youthful trips to corner drugstore counters. Housewives loved how easily the ingredients could be kept on hand and how quickly the drink came together when a sweet craving struck. Served in tall glasses with paper straws, it turned an ordinary afternoon into a celebration and reminded everyone of carefree days. This quick fountain-style treat captured the hopeful, fun-loving spirit of the 1950s and showed how simple pantry items could deliver a true taste of happiness. Ketchup meat marinades were the unsung heroes of tough cuts. If the meat was chewy or on the edge of spoiling, ketchup was your best bet. Mixed with vinegar, onions, and sometimes a bit of sugar, it created a tangy brine that broke down fibers and gave the meat a richer taste. The acidity worked like magic, especially overnight in the icebox, or even just an hour before cooking. Frying or grilling after a ketchup soak gave the meat a caramelized crust and a deep savory flavor that covered up any flaws. It was a go-to for cheap steaks, pork scraps, and even liver. Some families added garlic or mustard, others kept it plain. Either way, it was dependable. You will not find this trick in high-end recipes or modern cookbooks, but it worked so well that it stayed in rotation for decades. Ketchup was more than a condiment. It was a tool. And for a lot of families, it turned subpar meat into something you actually looked forward to. Pot and pot steaming was a workaround so clever it made most kitchen gadgets look unnecessary. No steamer basket? No problem. You just nested a smaller pot or bowl inside a larger one filled with a little water, covered the whole thing tightly, and let the steam do its job. Vegetables came out soft but not soggy. Dumplings puffed up like clouds, and even old bread could be gently rewarmed without drying out. You had to keep an eye on the water level so it would not boil dry, but once you got the hang of it, this method became second nature. It was quiet cooking. No sizzling, no flipping. Just warm air lifting food to the finish line. People used it for everything from puddings to tamales. Today, we buy tiered steamers and electric setups, but this old trick used what you already had. It turned basic pots into tools of precision, all without spending a dollar. And for many home cooks, that made all the difference. Saltine cracker pie crust was the quiet hero of the no-frills American dessert scene. Before graham crackers took over, home bakers turned to what they had, plain old saltines. Crushed up, mixed with sugar and melted margarine, and pressed into a pie dish, these humble crackers transformed into a sturdy, slightly salty base that balanced sweet fillings beautifully. You would find this crust holding up lemon chiffon pies, coconut cream, and even banana pudding. The salt gave it a surprising edge, cutting through all the sugar and keeping things from tasting one note. Sometimes cooks would toast it in the oven before adding the filling, just to give it extra crunch. And while it never became a household staple like graham cracker crusts, it held on as a clever trick among thrifty bakers. If your pantry was low and your guests were coming soon, this crust saved the day. It tasted like ingenuity, like making dessert work even when you were one step from out of options. That was the kind of creativity that turned crackers into cornerstones. Bacon grease jar cooking was not just a habit, it was a household rule. You never threw out bacon fat, not once. It was poured hot into a tin can or a glass jar, usually kept by the stove, and reused for just about everything. Fried potatoes, sautéed greens, biscuits brushed on top for that golden shine. Some families even swore by it for making popcorn. It added flavor where there was none and stretched what little fat you had across the whole week. Bacon grease turned bland cabbage into something rich and smoky. It revived day-old cornbread and crisped up onions like nothing else. The jar was never labeled, and no one needed it to be. You just knew what it was by the smell. Today, we are told to throw away fat and use olive oil instead. But back then, this was gold. It was seasoning, substance, and thrift all in one. And even though it is missing from most cookbooks now, that old bacon jar still lives on in a few quiet kitchens that remember its worth. Prune whip dessert was the fiber-rich cloud that showed up at church luncheons and retirement homes across the country. It was sweet, airy, and oddly elegant, made by pureeing stewed prunes, folding them into stiffly beaten egg whites, and chilling the whole thing until it held its shape. It sounds strange now, but it was a hit in the 1930s through the 1950s, especially with older folks or anyone on a digestive diet. Prunes were cheap, shelf-stable, and full of nutrients, and this dessert made them feel like a treat instead of medicine. Some cooks added a bit of lemon juice or vanilla for brightness, while others served it with a dollop of whipped evaporated milk or even custard. The result was light on the tongue and surprisingly satisfying, especially if you had grown tired of gelatin molds. It was not a dish that screamed decadence, but it whispered health, comfort, and just a little bit of sweetness. The kind you served to someone who needed a gentle dessert and a moment of peace. Egg white paint for pie crust shine was the kind of kitchen trick passed down without words, just by watching someone do it. Before you had glossy photos in cookbooks or pre-made pastry shells, a good pie was known by its crust. And nothing made that crust sing like a simple swipe of beaten egg white. It gave a golden sheen, a crisp snap when bitten, and just enough polish to make it feel like a special occasion. No butter wash, no fancy glaze, just a leftover egg white, whisked and brushed on with a fingertip or scrap of cloth. It was used on both sweet and savory pies, and sometimes even on biscuits or rolls for that bakery look. You could even sprinkle sugar or seeds on top, and the egg white would help it stick. Today's recipes might tell you to use milk or yolk, but the old cooks knew egg whites gave the cleanest, crispest finish. It was quiet elegance from a cupboard that had very little to give.